And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
On Hong Also, on 9 other officials, Hong Kong on Saturday released a statement calling these sanctions, quote, shameless and despicable, end quote, accusing U.S. officials of ignoring the rule of law in order to make, quote, unsubstantiated and sweeping comments to serve their own interest, end quote. On Sunday, yesterday, prominent Hong Kongese businessman, publisher, and owner of the Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, was arrested for collusion with foreign powers under the security law put into effect in Hong Kong on June 30th. In our next story, the United States has passed 5 million cases on Sunday, stands now at about 5,200,000 cases and over 165,000 deaths. 9 students contracted COVID after a school reopened last week, forcing the school reclosure. A bunch of schools are reopening, and there's a whole bunch of controversy happening on this issue, and we should get more into that. I'm just saying that's a big thing going on right now in American culture. Probably the sort of most important interface right now. Anyway, Brazil has passed 100,000 coronavirus deaths. On Sunday, Australia had its deadliest day yet with 17 deaths. And in certain very crowded parts of Paris, masks are now mandated outdoors. Meanwhile, New Zealand has hit 100 days without any community transmission. Next story. In Virginia, rent memoriams begin today, going until September 7th. This follows a decision by Virginia's Supreme Court to grant Governor Ralph Northam the ability to suspend evictions. That follows a request by him on July 24th. Virginia had used some $50 million in federal coronavirus aid to fund rent relief programs. Texas's Attorney General Ken Paxton, meanwhile, released a letter with non-binding legal guidance saying that local officials in Texas don't have the legal authority to impose rent memoriams, writing that, quote, while local officials do possess certain emergency powers, statewide eviction procedures far exceed the requirement that those powers be exercised on an appropriate local scale, end quote. This follows decisions by the mayor of Austin and the judge for Travis County last month to extend eviction moratoriums until September 30th. So in Virginia, the Supreme Court gives Governor Northam the ability to suspend them. In Texas, the AG basically says that local officials can't do that. They don't have the powers. Again, though, this comes after the mayors of Austin and the judge for Travis County have already done that. We'll see how this all settles out. It's interesting to look at this stuff from the state's perspective, which is where this was going before Trump's executive order on Saturday. Next story. Presidential candidate Joseph R. Biden Jr. is expected to choose his vice presidential running mate this week, with Kamala Harris widely put in the top slot. But Willie Brown, the first black mayor of San Francisco, has encouraged Kamala Harris to say no to a Biden vice presidency and instead go for an AG pick, an AG spot in his administration as Attorney General. Other leading candidates for that VP pick right now are former UN Ambassador Susan Rice and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The motorcycle festival Sturgis is ongoing in the city of Sturgis, South Dakota right now, with almost 500,000 people attending in total. The event will be going on until Sunday, with it recommended but not required that attendees wear face masks. The state has had a total of 9,605 cases and 146 deaths. Also in South Dakota news, in the New York Times, according to an unnamed Republican official, the White House reportedly had an aide reach out to the governor of South Dakota about having Trump added to Mount Rushmore last year. When Trump visited South Dakota on July 4th this year, he was given a replica of Mount Rushmore by the state's Governor Kristi Noem. That replica featured his face added to Mount Rushmore. Trump had originally raised that topic the first time they met in 2017, shortly after he took office, according to Kristi Noem, who said that it had always been his dream to have his face on Mount Rushmore. When asked about the question, the White House didn't refuse that it had sent the request to South Dakota's governor's office and said that Mount Rushmore was a federal and not a state monument. My take would be they're claiming jurisdiction, essentially. They're saying it's more under their purview than it necessarily is Nome's or South Dakota's. Again, interesting to see this after Mount Rushmore came up in a couple of months ago during this whole culture war thing going on. Very interesting to see this all playing out. And our next story, the largest earthquake since the year 1916 hit North Carolina on Sunday morning at around 8 a.m. local time, when an earthquake with a magnitude of 5.2 hit just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. In our next story, internationally, on Sunday, Saudi Arabia limited the volume of crude oil it sends to America for the second time in 3 years. So this is sort of loose analysis of data, but basically tankers were coming in almost daily. Oil tankers were coming in almost daily from Saudi Arabia to the States a couple of months ago. But then in July and going into August, tankers have been down to something like almost once a week. So they're significantly down. Shipments, imports from Saudi Arabia are significantly down. A choice by Saudi Arabia. Just interesting to note. Next story. In Lebanon, 2 government ministers have resigned amid protests following last week's explosion in Beirut, in which at least 158 people were killed and over 6,000 were injured. Lebanon's information minister, Manal Abdel Samad, announced a resignation criticizing Prime Minister Hassan Diab's government. Shortly after, Environment Minister Damianos Kadar also resigned from his post. France and the United Nations led a virtual donor conference in the aftermath of the explosion at the Beirut port, pledging nearly $300 million in humanitarian assistance to be, quote, directly delivered to the Lebanese population, end quote. Meanwhile, in Belarus, protests erupted late last night after early election results showed Alexander Lukashenko winning a re-election with an 82% majority against his main rival, opposition candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who said in a news conference late Sunday night that she did not agree with the results. The night before the election, Tikhanovskaya's campaign said she had fled her apartment out of safety concerns. Live feeds in the capital, Minsk, showed riot police using tear gas and stun grenades to disperse protesters. And in my last story this morning, at least 18 people were killed and more than 120 were injured after a plane skidded off a runway in the South Indian state of Kerala. The plane was carrying people returning to India after being stranded abroad due to the coronavirus pandemic. Those are the headlines. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Jamarl, what's on your agenda for today, man? What are you thinking about?
So what's on my agenda for today has to do with Trump's press conference, that presser. Basically, Trump goes out, signs an executive order, and it's the executive order that basically Shane discussed. It's supposed to be dealing with the crisis that Congress was not necessarily able to come to an agreement on. Think of it this way. The president is in a pickle. He has a certain issue associated with ensuring that the public is made whole. And the public at this point blames the president of basically all of the failings. The 160-something thousand people that are dead, the 30 million or whatever that are out of healthcare, out of insurance. Out of work. in addition to the number of people that are also out of healthcare, the number of people that are going to be evicted. These numbers are going to be astonishing. We're talking about millions of people being flung out of their homes. Now, Congress knew that the date was going to be what the date was. Congress still waited to the last minute of July and let all of those benefits, be it the unemployment benefits of $600, or for that matter, the other benefit associated with the moratorium on evictions, let it pass. Everybody was shocked on a day that those people created. And so then you get to the date, nobody comes up with a deal, everybody suffers, and everybody is shocked as if Congress had no idea that this date was ever going to come to pass. Utterly astonishing and utterly appalling. The Democrats do have let's say, a political interest in ensuring that Trump fails. Now, you could say that's harsh. You could say that's horrible. I'm not saying that Nancy Pelosi is intentionally trying to tank the deal in order to make sure that Trump fails. Not saying that at all. But it is in her best interest. Let's be honest. And if it is in their best interest, their, let's say, leverage in regards to a deal, well, they're going to think they have leverage and they're going to be more resistant to a deal. Republicans would do the exact same thing if they were in the exact same circumstance. Trump, bit of consternation, says, fine, if you guys are going to do the deal, I'm going to do it myself, believing that he has some kind of clout, leverage, or constitutionality to do all sorts of things that the president does not have the power and ability to do. This goes into unemployment benefits, where he's trying to push states to create an entirely new process to give out money. And even with that, the state is going to have to put money up themselves. And keep in mind, the states are already cash strapped. The states are broke. The states don't have this money now, and Trump is expecting them to put up a new program. You have this other situation where the president is requiring a moratorium on evictions. This doesn't deal with homeowners. This doesn't deal with people who are renting. 30% of people who are renting their houses are not going to be able to pay their rent in August. Payroll tax, it's not really a payroll tax in the way that we think about it. This is a deferment. And it's a deferment that is going to jostle Social Security and Medicare, because that's where he's trying to pull the money from. And student loans, something that is in the president's purview. Now, I want to get to a press conference. Trump, after signing this, realizes that this is on shaky ground constitutionally, legally, and everything else. And he comes out and is charged with a series of questions. Let's hear Trump, and let's hear how Trump deals with this. Let's play the clip.
Of Americans that need it. What date?
We think it's going to be very rapid. We want it to be very rapid. It's going to be distributed in a way that, whichever the fastest way, there are various methods, and it will be rapidly distributed.
You're also expecting legal challenges with this, right?
I didn't say that. No, I didn't say that.
Yesterday, sir, you said that you were expecting legal.
What I said is people can do whatever they want. I guess maybe they'll bring legal actions, maybe they won't, but they won't win. They won't win.
And legal action is brought against you on this. Why not just work with Congress on this deal?
Well, I'm not saying they're not going to come back and negotiate. They might very well come back and negotiate.
You're signing an executive order today, and Americans want to know when they're going to see this relief.
Very soon. They're going to see it very soon. Look, there it is, right there. Excuse me. There it is, right there. Go ahead.
Mr. President, though, this is expected to be tied up in the court, so this relief is either going to be delayed or blocked indefinitely.
I think this is going to go very rapidly through the courts. This will go very, if we get sued, maybe we won't get sued. If we get sued, it's somebody that doesn't want people to get money. Okay, and that's not going to be a very popular thing.
Go around Congress. Are you trying to set a new precedent that the president can go around Congress and decide how much?
You ever hear the word obstruction? They've obstructed. Congress has obstructed. The Democrats have obstructed people from getting desperately needed money. Go ahead, please, right here.
President, why do you keep saying that you passed veterans' choice? You passed veterans' choice. It was passed in 2014.
Okay, excuse me. Go ahead, please.
But it was a false statement, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's the end of that. After signing something that should have been momentous, because after all, this is a president that is trying to do something that Congress wasn't able to do, and he should be throwing his weight around talking about all the great provisions. Well, the problem is the president doesn't have the power of the purse. That is something that Congress has. And for all of the president's wants, these are not, with the exception of the school thing, within his power to do so. And even under the best of terms, this will still go slogging through the courts. The states don't have the money to do it, meaning the notion that the money will get through at all, let alone fast, is farcical. A for effort, not. But let's just be very clear. This is a president that is in a fix, and he doesn't know how to get himself out the fix. And he requires Congress to do so. And Congress is slow walking the situation. Shane, let's go to a break, and we'll have a conversation with Shane. We're also going to have Stephen Linman to give a larger conversation on this coming up. I think it's 7:30. So you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, that's 202-521-1320 if you want to call us. So, Jamarl, coming back on this conversation about the executive orders, I mean, I don't see this being a winning move by Democrats. I understand what you're saying about the constitutional arguments and the powers of the purse. I mean, another look at this is that we're in a crisis and Congress is at loggerheads and they're just not producing anything. And so this seems like the natural thing for him to try to do. In fact, if he didn't do this, I think a lot of people would be asking for it. And on the other hand, when the Democrats push back, it just looks crazy. I mean, they've been criticizing him for not doing enough, and now he's trying to do something, and then they would be pushing back on it. So I understand there are arguments probably in their favor legally, but at the very least optically, and probably in substance too, that's not a good move by the Democrats. They're trying to keep aid, assuming they're the main party pushing back, which of course I'm guessing they will be and are.
So yes and no. I mean, in one part, you have a situation where, let's say it this way. Republicans, Mitch McConnell said, I think he said 30% or 30, I can't remember which one, wouldn't vote for it at all. Meaning a large part of his constituency basically don't want to put anything up. You have states that are requiring cash. They need money. And within the context of requiring money, you have them saying, okay, now we're going to push this to states to get them to do a program that they can't afford to do. Like, understand the optics of it. So let's talk about it in two ways, the politics and the substance. Politically, what you have is a president who the public has looked at and is found wanting. That president is in the middle of a crisis, economic and social. And the social crisis is going to get that much worse based on the economics of the situation. Trump needs to do something. 1,000% agree. And I would even agree that the optics of a president looking like he's trying to do something is better than the optics of a president that's not. And I even agree with you with the Democrats thing. It looks bad when the president is saying, yes, I'm going to try to do this because Congress can't get itself together. And the Democrats are like, no, screw that. We're gonna stop you from getting money out to the public. Like, so I agree with you. The optics look bad. But I don't know. It feels wanting or something. It feels lacking because I know that the substance or whatever is not necessarily going to get out to the public themselves. So it's like the substance of what Trump is trying to do, I don't think is even going to get done, with the exception of the deferment for the school stuff. So I don't know. I mean, if the public looks at it and say, well, it's a president who's trying, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, again, it's going to, in terms of the dynamic and the dialectic, the back and forth, the Hegelian thing, where different events lead to future events that sort of culminate and then create conditions for future events, and the cycle continues. I don't know. From that perspective, this is not a good look for the Democrats, and it's a great look for Trump, I think, depending on how this goes. If it becomes a weeks-long process where the story is, and especially not just on Fox, but if it starts to break through into other media too, if it starts to break through into the more left-wing or more centrist wings of the media, that Trump is trying to push this package out. Sure, it's incomplete, but Democrats have been trying to push back on it. Depending on how long that process goes on for, and depending how long Congress takes. And again, Congress going into a sort of mixed recess where they're not in Congress, they're at home, but they can still do some stuff virtually. I'm just seeing things being slower there. It's probably going to take a while for them to actually seriously push back, let alone come up with their own new bill. I don't know. I'm not an experienced prognosticator, so I'm not going to lay that stuff out. But right now, I can definitely tell you, this is not a good look for the Democrats, man. That's my take.
That's interesting. I don't think it's a good look for either one, personally. I mean, let me say it this way. When you have Mitch McConnell basically saying that a large contingent of his group would not vote for anything, meaning they don't care one iota what it is, then Trump, to some degree, has a problem with his own team. I understand what the president wants, but Nancy Pelosi would agree on getting money out. I don't believe for one iota, one moment, that if a deal was reached where money would get to the states and so forth, that she wouldn't bite. She would have to bite. She wouldn't have a choice. The politics would demand it. The politics in this case, at least clearly by their appraisal, is that we are not the ones who are holding this process up. And, for Trump to put this stuff out, let's be clear. He's attacking Social Security, or at the very least the potential to be attacking Social Security with one of the other items. And depending on what the press does, meaning if the media and whatnot are just skeptical of this, and even if Fox News is like, oh man, I don't know how that works constitutionally, I don't know how fast it gets out. I don't know, man. I don't think it looks good for any of them. I guess that's the issue. I would agree. Honestly, if I'm Trump, I would do just this. I think you have to. So I'm not hitting him for the optics of it, because you can't look, if a president is standing by while Congress is just doing nothing as the country burns, that's problematic. So if nothing else, you got to do this. But maybe he needs a better politics to get that across. I'm not sure. I mean, that press conference was very immediately after he signed the executive order, and he couldn't even stand there and answer the basic questions because he was lying about the Veterans Act that was signed by Obama. Like, he couldn't just do basic stuff. So he's going to have to answer this, and he's going to have to go on. Both sides are looking bad, but it looks like Trump. Right. Oh, I see. Trump is putting pressure on McConnell to try to get the deal done. But see, I think it goes both ways. I think it undermines. Look, I think Democrats had a leverage in this. And I think the Republicans understood what the Democrats' leverage was. We want a deal. We want to give all of this money out to the public. The Republicans don't want to do it. Well, Trump tries to undermine and say, look, I'm going to get this done if you don't get it done. The Republicans wanted a smaller bill. Pelosi wanted a larger bill. And so Trump is like, well, fine, I'm going to pass on a smaller bill. Do something about it. Now, whether this is to undermine Pelosi or the Democrats, I strongly suggest it's to undermine the Democrats. Mitch McConnell would have accepted a tiny, tiny, tiny bill, even if many of his other Republicans wouldn't. Trump would have accepted a tiny, tiny, tiny bill. Democrats wanted more. They weren't wrong for wanting more. I mean, the states need more. The $600 was something that was necessary. The idea that millionaires and billionaires are quibbling over giving somebody an extra $200 is just obscene. And it's there to keep the economy afloat. I don't think he entirely did for McConnell, even though I guess that point of view could be seen. I really do think this was trying to undermine Pelosi. So it really does boil down to, Shane, public perception. The reality of it is that a lot of this is probably constitutional and would get held up. And the states wouldn't have the money to do it, even if the states wanted to do it. On the other side of it, it is a president that's looking like he's trying to get something done. Maybe that works. Maybe that's enough.
If it gets held up constitutionally, then there are going to be a certain percentage of people on the left who agree that there are genuine constitutional grounds and that's not politically motivated. But if it gets held up constitutionally, if it gets held up in the courts, and you have a chorus of opposition to it coming from Democrats, then I think the consensus among a lot of people, the sort of tacit consensus, is going to be that this is politically biased, and therefore it's going to be in Trump's favor. Because while tens of millions of Americans across the country are wanting a deal from Congress or are wanting money, all they really want is money and the ability to stay in their apartment or their house or whatever. Yeah. While tens of millions of people want that, what they're going to see is Trump pushing for it, Congress not getting anything done, and the Democrats primarily pushing back on Trump pushing for it. So again, from the ground level, I just see this being a terrible move to push back on. I think that the best way to push, I don't even know. I can stop there because in some sense that's the sort of first chess move that I don't see how you get a response to. It seems to sacrifice more than it gains from the Democrats' perspective.
Oh, you mean by attacking Trump for this? by going after
Yeah,
him.
but and I don't see. In other words, unless they speed up, the thing is that he acted first here in this round. He made the first move. So if they push his thing back, delay that slightly, and then pass their own thing, that's still not going to be egg on their face, because it'll still be a delay on genuinely needed payments, and stopgap for evictions and all this stuff. So yeah, I don't see this playing out any other way than at least a little bit good for Trump, and at least a little bit bad for Democrats and people going against Trump. One more quick point, and then I'll go back to you. But one quick point here. It's not just Democrats versus Republicans. It's really Democrats and Republicans versus each other, and then Trump as his own candidate. If Republicans fail, sure, Trump is viewed as their sort of corraler. I mean, he is the Republican contender, but he was also a Republican renegade running in 2016. And I think a lot of his voters are disenfranchised enough from the Republican Party, or disillusioned enough with it, that they're not going to be too worried about the Republicans failing and Trump winning, or about how Republicans have failed to get this through Congress. Really, that's all I'm saying. Go ahead, Jamarl.
I don't think I entirely disagree with your points, and all of this to some degree is prognostication. So, fair enough. Take all the stuff with a grain of salt. I think the thing is, the crux of it is we're trying to decide how the public responds to Donald Trump doing this. And I think, like you said, there's several levels. There's the public, but there's also the substance. There's what he gets done. And like you said, if, the thing I'm curious about, what happens if when Obamacare came out, and if the courts struck Obamacare down, would you have considered it unconstitutional in the way that, meaning, do you think that if Obamacare was struck down, that the courts and the public would look at it and say, okay, well, that wasn't constitutional that Obama did it, and then would look at it unfavorably? Or do you think that the upholding of it by the Supreme Court in and of itself was something that gave it almost like a stamp of approval? I guess I'm thinking, is this something similar? If this stuff gets shot down by the courts, let's say 3 of the items get shot down saying you don't have the power to do it. Or let's say if the Democrats just stand by and say, okay, let Trump do those programs because the states can't afford those programs anyway, so the programs are not going to go anywhere. But if these get struck down by the courts, do you think the perception of the public would turn immediately to this was a political farce? I don't know. And maybe this is, like you said, this is kind of spitting in the wind to some degree, because it's hard to know how the public sees it. I guess we give it a week and see what happens, but we can definitely talk about the substance of it politically, what it does materially in real terms, and whether or not it would be a benefit to the public. I guess these are two separate conversations almost.
One of the responses, I mean, I'll put up, I think Obamacare is an interesting parallel, but one of the ways that it's definitely not a parallel is that while the healthcare crisis in America is chronic, it's not exactly acute, whereas coronavirus is nothing but an acute crisis. It's something that suddenly came, that has a sort of time limit. It's getting worse, and the sort of follow-on conditions from it, the decline of the economy, not everybody, but a lot of people potentially getting thrown out of their homes after they can't make their payments. You can just imagine the decline of a country pretty quickly if they don't respond to this adequately. That's a crisis with a capital C. Unlike what Obamacare was trying to fix, which was this decades-long problem with the healthcare system. The timeliness of it makes a big difference in terms of what responses are justified. And I think another side of this is that, if it gets held up in the courts, if it gets slowed down, that's not philosophical for people. That's real. If payments are delayed by weeks or months, that's the interval in which people are going to start getting kicked out of their homes, and it's going to become a huge problem. So I think that, the timeliness of it is huge. And that's what, we're going to see in the next couple of weeks what the response is, how all this stuff plays out. This will be a tiny opportunity to test our rationality skills. We should maybe start making predictions and then going back and checking them. And I don't even know, there's some way to do this pretty well. We should go into a break. We'll be back in a minute. We're going to be joined by Stephen Lenman, be a great guest, talking about geopolitics and this whole thing too, the executive orders coming out and the potential effects, potential responses, the legal crisis we could see, constitutional crisis even. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Stephen Lenman this segment. We're talking about the 4 new executive orders, Trump attempting a congressional workaround. We're also going to be talking about TikTok, Trump, the United States, a bit of Microsoft thrown in there, I'm sure. Again, though, joined by Stephen Lenman, author and geopolitical analyst. Stephen, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, Shane, Jamal, doing well. Good to be on with you. Yeah, things just seem to be going from bad to worse. It really is incredible, the moves. I'm not really surprised by what Trump did over the weekend. I'm still upset about it, and it's an unconstitutional act. It's a very dangerous and reckless act.
So what do you not like about it, Stephen?
Well, what he did is he issued 1 executive order and 3 memorandums, and he circumvented Congress. Congress has exclusive appropriations authority, not the White House. He's getting around that in part by using $40 or $50 billion of FEMA money that is only became FEMA money because Congress appropriated it, and FEMA is supposed to be involved in dealing with national emergencies, hurricane damage, flood, stuff like that, not circumventing Congress so Trump can do what he pleases. So this, to me, is an unconstitutional act. I guess lawyers could argue this. Some might agree with me, and some might say otherwise. It's very possible this thing will go to the courts, even up to the Supreme Court, very conservative, more right-wing justices than otherwise. So it's very possible they could side with Trump just the way it did with Bush in 2000, 5-4 ruling, handing the election to Bush, even though Gore won it. And then he won again in 2004, but Bush served 2 terms.
Stephen, with Trump doing this, when Trump first said that he was going to do this and he was teasing this, my thought was that he was trying to undermine Democrats, that he wanted a deal. Nancy Pelosi wanted a larger deal because Nancy Pelosi saw her stock in this very specific contest between the two as being higher. And so she wanted more from the negotiation. And this was Trump's way of trying to break the deadlock, saying, I'm the president, I'm going to do this. I think legally, I totally agree with you. I think it's problematic that the president is basically trying to usurp Congress appropriation authority. But from the political optics standpoint, what do you think of it? Like, do you think this is something that the public looks at and says, okay, well, the president's trying to be the president and is trying to get over Congress, meaning they may not look at it in the strict constitutionality in the way that you are, but they may be looking at it similar to the way Shane is of, look, the people need stuff. The president is trying to do it. What's wrong with that point of view? And is there anything wrong with that point of view in and of itself? Not to mention, how do you think this will be judged by the public?
Well, I think the key to this is what will actually happen as a result of Trump's orders. Nothing will happen overnight. Millions of Americans are suffering. 55 million Americans applied for unemployment benefits. 55 million. There's never been a number anything like that. For 20 consecutive weeks, over 1 million Americans applied for unemployment insurance. I mean, during the Great Depression, the highest number before that was something like 695,000 during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Population was a lot smaller during the Great Depression. Unemployment then got up to 25% maximum. Unemployment, I think the highest, it's gone down. Unemployment, the highest back in March or April, was about 39%. I mean, the actual number based on the way it was calculated pre-1990, not the phony BLS numbers that are rigged. There's simply no meaning. The current unemployment rating number, according to the Labor Department, is about 10%. Well, if you calculate the number based on the formula used pre-1990, it's about 30%. 30%. Now, that's still higher than during the Great Depression. And things aren't improving. They're weakening. Outbreaks, COVID outbreaks are increasing, especially in certain states, Texas, Florida, California. I mean, they're saying record numbers of outbreaks in these states. They can ebb and flow a little bit, but certainly the situation is very bad. Americans are suffering greatly, and there should be no debate in Washington about what to do. People are in trouble. They need income. They need to be able to survive. But here's what bothers me the most. Providing income to needy Americans, the unemployed and other needy ones, if they qualify. This is important. You can't let people starve to death. People shouldn't be thrown out of their residences because they have no money to pay rent. Stuff like this is very important. But to me, what's important right along with this is what happened in the 1930s during the Franklin Roosevelt years in Congress that was controlled mostly by the Democrats. It's not happening today. And what happened then was there were many jobs creation programs, an alphabet soup of them. And this is what put many Americans back to work. Between 1933, the low point of the Depression, and about 1937, unemployment dropped from about 25% to about 11 or 12%. That's a huge drop. It was still high, but it went way, way down, roughly about cut in half. It went way back up again because the Roosevelt people thought they licked the problem, which they didn't. They eased up on the programs, and unemployment shot back up again. Then it went way back down as the build-up for World War II began. I hope we're not seeing a repeat of that ahead. That's not the way you want to increase employment. We had full employment during the war, but that's not what you want. But what the country mostly needs now are jobs creation programs to get people back to work, to put money in their pocket because they're earning it, and when they have it, they spend it, and this is the way the economy grows. There is no economic growth that is happening based on the policies that are happening right now, and both the Dems and the Republicans are not addressing this issue. They're both guilty. The stuff that the Dems want to give to the unemployed, $3.4 trillion, according to the Dem proposal, $1 trillion by the Republicans. I mean, this stuff is political posturing. You need to address the core problem, which is getting people on the job back to work. But if there are no jobs, they can't go back to work. So it's up to if industry won't create jobs, it's the responsibility of government to do it. That's what happened in the 1930s. That is what is not happening now. To me, that's the core issue.
So I could see that. I just don't know what those jobs are going to be. Like you're saying, we're in the crisis right now. We're in the middle of this pandemic. It's very difficult for people to get into a job, out into the street. Most people seem to be wanting to stay at home. That seems to be where most people are, including the unemployed. And I know a few who've become unemployed during the crisis, and they're making enough to live on. They're making enough to subsist from unemployment. They were, at least, and that suffices for them. But again, I don't know where we would see a New Deal style big jobs program. What specific industries are candidates for that? I don't know. Would the government hire people to go online and sort of try to correct each other's opinions? That's where my mind farcically jumps to, just because that seems to be the cultural moment we're inhabiting right now. But I legitimately don't know. And then the fallback on that, of course, is just giving people money. That lowers productivity, but at least it gives them enough to survive. But as you were just talking about, there's like a $2.4 trillion gap between the two bills that the parties are combating over right now, or at least they were until they went out of session. I don't That's the thing. Looking at this, I think you're very correct in your analysis of the problems that each of the parties had. And I can look cynically at what Trump's doing now. Like, I've been framing it positively, but I could frame it cynically too, as this is the rise of a demagogue, populist candidate in the sort of original negative sense, somebody who's defying the current political system and breaking the current political system in the process in order to, give himself new powers, basically, by giving the public some of what they want and just expanding his own powers. I could look at it cynically in that way, but I can't help but feel that if it weren't $400 a week but instead were $800 a week that Trump had included in his executive order there, I can't help but feel that there would be less pushback. I can't help but feel that a lot of the arguments about the constitutionality or the legality of these executive orders has to do more with their contents, has to do more with the level of welfare they've provided instead of the actual form that welfare has taken. What's your take on that, Stephen?
Well, I wanted to comment on what the government can do. The programs in the 1930s were involved in building infrastructure. There were dams built. Chicago's lakefront was built during the 1930s. I live along the lakefront, so I literally, I can't look out the window and see exactly what happened, but I can walk out of where I live and look up the lakefront and see exactly what was built during the 1930s. U.S. infrastructure has really declined greatly. There is just tremendous work that needs to be done that has not been done because the U.S. resources have been diverted to other things, to militarism, to war making, to corporate handouts, stuff like that. So there's tremendous infrastructure needs in the country. This is a major thing that the government could do by putting people back to work, building infrastructure. There were other things in the 1930s as well, related more to socially related things. But I think infrastructure was the main way that many people were put back to work, and you could pay them decent wages so they could live. And it's not a final solution to the problem, because you need to get business rolling again to hire people back. But if people have money and they spend it and the economy grows, then corporations will begin hiring back people, and then they can take over the heavy lifting of jobs creation from government. But right now, companies are not hiring because there isn't demand for their products. So the government has to step in and do something. Otherwise, it's a vicious circle. Just giving people unemployment benefits ad infinitum, that'll let them pay bills and stay in their homes, but it won't solve the problem of the need to create economic growth. And that's what the country has to do. The people in power need to do that, and there's nothing being done to do that.
I could see that, but again, I could see there's a space politically within the next year for a sort of public works program like you're talking about. But I don't know how that's going to happen if it's a literal, physical, in-person public works program, because if you have a bunch of people working on job sites together, then you're probably going to have transmission of the disease, unless you have ample PPE, and even then that becomes a kind of a mess to work with. But where do you see that? What do you think? Infrastructure? What are you thinking, Stephen?
Well, that's a good point, but the great majority of infections happen indoors, not outdoors. I've seen the percentage of something like maybe 2 or 3% happen outdoors, not indoors. Chicago, there's a saying about Chicago, a lot of sayings about Chicago, but one of them is Chicago has 2 seasons, winter and construction. I said this to a construction worker just the other day taking a walk. There is construction going on around Chicago today. I take a walk for exercise every day, and I walk past one mini project after another, workers in the streets. I haven't seen any local headlines about people getting sick by being out on the job and fixing whatever they're fixing, water pipes or whatever, but doing a lot of mini construction jobs that I can see where I live. I don't know what's going on in the rest of the city, but I imagine some of this is going on elsewhere in other cities. I think this could be done without a great risk of greatly increasing the number of COVID infections. I think there could be some, but I think the risk would be minimal. And people can wear masks outside to minimize the risk of infection. They could do other things to protect themselves. You don't need people standing side by side. They can be working with a little bit of separation. So I think by doing this in a responsible way, you could do it without a lot of negative effects. The NBA right now is getting away with operating in a bubble, and there certainly is very close contact in what they're doing. Well, it's early in the game for them. We'll see whether that works for the whole period of time. It's worked so far. It may work for the sports that are happening outdoors. Baseball going, football will be starting soon. If that works, that would be a good indication that construction could go on fairly large scale without fear that you really increase the COVID outbreaks greatly. I suspect they would not increase greatly.
That is the voice of Stephen Lendman. We'll be back with him in just a minute. Stephen Lendman, geopolitical analyst and author. Real quick lead, you can check his work out, stephenlendman.org. Just go to stephenlendman.org. Again, Stephen Lendman, thank you for joining us. We'll be back with him in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We are joined by Stephen Lendman, author and geopolitical analyst. Stephen, I always enjoy when you're on the show because I like your point of view and the way you look at this stuff. I agree with you with the infrastructure stuff. The United States infrastructure is crumbling, and we have money, basically, from the standpoint we need money or people in money's pockets. And if you send people out to do things that build up their communities, I think that's a perfect example. So let's say dilapidated factories, maybe those places can make food, some kind of automated system that produces food cheaply, maybe solar power, ensuring that houses have access to solar power and batteries so, those people can do it. I got to be honest, I almost don't even care what it is. I just want money in people's pockets. And it seems like the federal government is the one to do it. Is this not an ideological argument, though? That part and parcel to the reason that Republicans don't do this is because private enterprise don't want the federal government on its territory of creating jobs. Because if the federal government creates a job for $15 an hour, then all of those other private entities are going to have to pay something similar. They don't want the competition. Is that where this is really coming from? It's more of an ideological argument that is being propagated in Congress?
Well, yeah, I think you have a very important point. That could be very, very well true. Of course, at the same time, you've got a major problem. I mean, the worst economic debacle in the history of the country. So the politicians just sit on their hands and argue with each other. I know there's a lot of posturing going on in the run-up to the November 3rd elections, congressional, presidential, and of course local elections as well. So everything politicians are doing right now is what these elections in mind. The Dems want $3.4 trillion. They're no more considerate of public need than Republicans, but they want to be perceived as being more considerate than Republicans. And Republicans, and the penny Republicans, is less considerate because they're only offering 1/3 as much. Pelosi said she compromised. She was willing to come down $1 trillion if the Republicans came up $1 trillion, and that idea was turned down apparently. Well, it must have been turned down because of what Trump did over the weekend. As far as whether people will go along with what he's done, it depends on what happens. If people continue to suffer and what Trump did is not implemented, so nothing is put in the pockets of people to have any money, and evictions start happening, which they will anyway. Trump's safety net on evictions only applies to federally backed mortgages, stuff like that. I mean, anything unrelated to the federal government, these people are vulnerable to being evicted. And by the end of the year or into next year, there could be millions of people who will be thrown out of their residences because they don't have income to pay rent. Same thing on student loans. It only applies to federally backed loans that were made, not to privately obtained loans. So it's a very shaky program that Trump put out, and it may take a great deal of time to be implemented. And of course, he wants states to pay 25% of $400 a month to workers. Where are they going to get the money? They don't have the money to operate now. They need financial aid from the federal government, which they're not getting. So I don't know how they're going to come up with $200 million or more, depending on the state, to fund the unemployment benefits on top of what they're already paying. So there are lots of problems with what Trump introduced or recommended, proposed, just being able to implement this stuff. And if it doesn't work, and if people continue to suffer, he'll be a one-term president. If people benefit from what he proposed, he would certainly have a much better chance of being reelected. But if the suffering continues, and I don't see anything he did that will relieve suffering by November especially, so he very well may be a one-term president.
So let's move to TikTok for the moment. Donald Trump is proposing a war on TikTok. Now, this is weird and strange. The United States, for the most part, having unchallenged authority as being, the number one capitalist economy, would allow its companies to basically give technology and work in China in order to produce goods to come back into the United States, removing any kind of tariffs or anything else to cut down the prices on those goods. Those companies were able to benefit by dropping the amount that they had to pay to workers and paying the Chinese less. Now the United States doesn't like it because it realizes that China has become an economic and global competitor. So the United States, under the guise of Trump, has taken on the opinion and the point of view that it can go through and use political might in order to stem economic expansion. And that's basically what seems to be taking place with TikTok, where the United States is now accusing TikTok of being some kind of data mining operation for China. The federal courts, or TikTok, is apparently going to fight this. Now, can you explain the underlying legalities of what Donald Trump is doing and the classification of TikTok as this kind of foreign enemy of sorts?
Well, I guess they could probably find a way to make this thing legal, but this goes way beyond TikTok. It's mainly a U.S. war against Chinese technology. There have been over 150 tech-related Chinese companies that have been targeted by Trump. The biggest one, of course, is Hawaii. I may not be pronouncing it right. Pronounce Hawaii. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it right. Hawaii, is that the correct pronunciation?
Huawei. That's usually how I've heard it.
Huawei. Yeah, it's Huawei.
Huawei. I'll probably go back to Hawaii. Huawei. That's the big one because it's the leader in rolling out 5G, and 5G has the potential of multi-trillions of dollars. The U.S. telecom companies are salivating over getting a big piece of that. They'll compete with European ones, but I'll call them Huawei. It's just easy.
It's Huawei, yeah.
They're well ahead in rolling this out, and they stand to benefit the most, and that's why they were targeted. Just a major high-tech company. But you've got TikTok, you've got WeChat, you've got other companies. Huawei, by the way, has 70 affiliate companies that were also targeted by Trump. So you've got all of these tech-related companies that were targeted by Trump. It really is the U.S. plan to undermine China technologically, but also industrially, economically, because China is the U.S. number one economic competitor, and it's on a track in the years ahead. I don't think there's any way to stop this. China will be, maybe in the next decade or so, maybe a little longer than that, maybe sooner, who knows, the world's largest economy, and people in Washington from both parties simply cannot tolerate the notion of the U.S. not being number one economically. It still will be number one militarily, but China is also a military power, and one day, I would imagine, no doubt in this century, China will be number one militarily, economically, maybe financially, the number one country in the world. 20th century belonged to America. The 21st century, I believe, belongs to China. And the U.S. is going all out to prevent this. I think they're waging a losing battle.
Well, I mean, you can see that going back to Hillary Clinton, the U.S. State Department's pivot to Asia about a decade ago. You can see the U.S. preparing for that. I mean, that's what's been on everybody's minds. But I want to come back down to something that you were getting at briefly, sort of underlying this issue, and then come back to China. On this issue of surveillance, I mean, the whole thing here, it's not just a U.S. versus China contest. It's also about this issue of Chinese surveillance of Americans. That's been a sort of lingering thing for as long as TikTok has been popular, for a few years now in the U.S., where ever since I first heard about it, it was sort of framed in those terms as a Chinese company, with people being worried about the potential for surveillance. I'll just note a few things here. Quickly, I suppose I can go through three. For one thing, I've heard from a venture capitalist in the Bay Area that, from her experience, from things she's seen and people she knows and conversations she's had, it's sort of widely and tacitly known that a lot of the antitrust fears in Silicon Valley, that big media companies are feeling, big social media companies specifically are feeling, your Googles, your Facebooks, your Twitters, a lot of those are alleviated by maintaining high-level contacts with various branches of the U.S. government and various intelligence agencies. Basically, they're staving off an antitrust lawsuit by doing information sharing and by sort of selectively making concessions to the U.S. state's demands for info. So that's point number one, is that on our end, our own tech companies are being, they're being sort of leveraged by the United States to spy on us. That's no surprise to anybody. Thing two, Cass Sunstein. So this guy's an American legal scholar, behavioral economist, and he was in the White House, the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2012. As far as I can tell, he was one of a number of people that set up this wave. If you think there was the Patriot Act, 2001, 2002, you have the development of a lot of these concerns. And then going into the Obama administration, I only pieced these puzzle pieces together later. There was this new wave and a pivot to online and the internet. And Cass Sunstein, if you go check out his Wikipedia page, you can learn more. There's this whole essay I read a couple of years ago that he wrote on conspiracy theories, but basically getting into online communities and trying to disrupt their behavior in order to stave off the rise of conspiracy theories. Go ahead, check it out. There's a whole little subsection on Wikipedia about it. My point is, he wrote that in 2008. He entered the Obama administration in 2009. I could see the potential at that point for a major shift in some branches of the political system in the U.S. in terms of how they work and how they operate online. I think we're seeing the effects of that now. My just last point briefly, and coming back to the issue of China specifically, Microsoft's in talks to buy them. So apparently on a sort of root level in Beijing with ByteDance, it seems like there's a very, very high possibility that Microsoft is going to go ahead and actually just buy TikTok outright. Now, there are all these questions about what that process would look like, if they would have to get rid of programmers or rewrite a big bunch of the code base in order to stave off those security concerns. But just for a second, just sort of looking at it on those terms, where do you think that would go, Stephen? How do you think that would work? What's your take on that issue and about the last minute that we have?
Well, number one, over the weekend, I learned that the CIA apparently told the Trump people they have no evidence that TikTok is supplying user data to China. The CIA, that really surprised me. Of course, Edward Snowden, a number of years ago, exposed the fact that Big Brother is no longer fiction. Big Brother now is real, and I'm certain the U.S. companies are in cahoots with people in Washington, with the agencies in Washington to spy on us. I live believing that anything I say electronically or write electronically, telephone, computer, whatever, could easily be monitored by the government so they can know everything that I do. I have nothing to hide, so I don't care that they know everything I do. But it's a very worrisome situation. It concerns me that I certainly don't believe any cool-headed person, and there are cool-headed people in Washington who want to risk a war with China. Certainly, China want a war with the U.S. And yet, stuff can happen. A phrase I use all the time is, stuff can happen by accident or design. And the way things are going, with one shoe dropping after another, U.S. hostile policies toward China, that maybe something could happen that could bring friction between both countries, and we could end up with a conflict that could be small or could be more serious. And both countries are nuclear powers. They could destroy the cities in each other's countries. It's a very situation.
It is. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Really glad to have you. You've been listening to the voice of Stephen Lendman, author and geopolitical analyst. You should check out his work at stephenlendman.org. We'll be back in a minute with another 2 hours of the most disruptive show in American politics. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And on an impromptu bike tour, okay, not really, I am your radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines in the news. Trump signed 4 executive orders on Saturday, one giving $400 per week in unemployment benefits, one giving a payroll tax deferment for employees, one that promises to temporarily halt some evictions, which are reasonably necessary to prevent further spread of COVID-19, quote unquote, and one extending student relief from September 30th until the end of the year. The deferral on employee payroll tax lasts up until the end of the year. It's 6.2% for Social Security and 1.45% for Medicare. Trump says that he plans to forgive the taxes and make those permanent cuts to payroll if elected. Understand, those payroll taxes are basically undermining Social Security and Medicare that Trump is arguing he will not let fail and that he will support with the general fund. The $400 per week unemployment payments will be paid partly by the federal government and part by the states. Under the current plan, states will pay 25% of the weekly $400, although on Sunday, Trump said if the states made requests for federal government to cover the remainder, they would review the case and possibly cover it. On Friday, the United States slapped sanctions on officials in Hong Kong and China, specifically Hong Kong's Governor Carrie Lam. Luo Huing, the head of China's liaison office in Hong Kong, and 9 other officials. Hong Kong on Saturday released a statement calling the sanctions shameless and despicable, accusing United States officials of ignoring the rule of law in order to make unsubstantiated and sweeping comments to serve their own interests. On Sunday, prominent Hong Kong East businessman, publisher, and owner of Apply Daily, Jimmy Lai, was arrested for collusion with foreign powers under the security law put into effect on June 30th. The United States passed 500 million cases on Sunday, standing now at about 5,200,000 cases and over 165,000 deaths. Brazil has also passed 100,000 deaths. On Sunday, Australia had its own deadliest day with 17 deaths. In certain very crowded parts of Paris, masks are now mandated outdoors. Meanwhile, New Zealand has hit 100 days without any community transmission. That's called competent governance. In Virginia, rent moratoriums begin today, going until September 7th. This follows a decision by Virginia Supreme Court to grant Governor Ralph Northam the ability to suspend evictions, following a request on July 24th. Virginia had used some $50 million in federal coronavirus aid to fund relief programs. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, meanwhile, released a letter with non-binding legal guidance saying that local officials in Texas don't have the legal authority to impose rent moratoriums, writing that, quote, while local officials do possess certain emergency powers, statewide eviction procedures far exceed the requirement that those powers can be exercised on in any appropriate local scale. This follows decisions by the mayor of Austin and a judge for Travis County last month to extend the eviction moratoriums until September 30th. Presidential candidate Joe Biden is expected to choose his vice presidential running mate, with Kamala Harris widely put in the top spot. But Whitney Brown, the first black governor of San Francisco, has encouraged Kamala Harris to say no to Biden's vice presidency and instead go for an attorney general pick. Other leading candidates are former UN Ambassador Susan Rice and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. The motorcycle festival Sturgis is ongoing in the city of Sturgis, South Dakota, with almost 500,000 people attending in total. The event will be going on until Sunday. With it, recommended but not required that attendees wear a face mask. The state has a total of 9,605 cases and 146 deaths. Also in South Dakota, in the New York Times, according to an unnamed Republican official, the White House reportedly had an aide reach out to Governor of South Dakota about having Trump added to Mount Rushmore. When Trump visited South Dakota on July 4th, he was given a replica of Mount Rushmore by the state's Governor Kristi Noem. Trump had originally raised the topic the first time they met in 2017, shortly after he took office, according to Kristi Noem, who said that it has always been his dream to have his face on Mount Rushmore. When asked about the question, the White House didn't refuse that it had sent the request to South Dakota's governor's office and said that Mount Rushmore was a federal and not a state monument. Interesting. The largest earthquake since the year 1916 hit North Carolina on Sunday morning at around 8 a.m. local time, when an earthquake with a magnitude of 5.2 hit just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. On Sunday, Saudi Arabia limited the volume of crude oil it sent to America for the second time in 3 years, with tankers of oil down almost daily. In Lebanon, 2 government ministers have resigned amid protests following last week's explosion in Beirut, which at least 158 people were killed and over 6,000 were injured. Lebanon's information minister, Manal Abdel Samad, announced her resignation, criticizing Prime Minister Hassan Diab's government. Shortly after, Environmental Minister Domeninos Qatar also resigned from his post. France and the United Nations led a virtual donor conference in the aftermath of the explosions at the Beirut port, pledging nearly $300 million in humanitarian assistance to be directly delivered to the Lebanese population. Protests erupted in Belarus late last night after early election results showed Alexander Lukashenko winning re-election with 82% majority against his main rival, opposition candidate Svetlana Tihevashenko. I am butchering that name, and I promise you I apologize. Who said in a news conference late Sunday night that she did not agree with the results. The night before the election, Svetlana campaign said that she had fled the apartment out of safety concerns. Live feeds in the capital, Minsk, show riot police using tear gas and stun grenades to disperse protesters. And last, at least 18 killed and more than 120 were injured after a plane skid off the runway in South Indiana in the state of Kerala. The plane was carrying people returning to India after being stranded abroad due to the coronavirus pandemic. And those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Also, just to be clear, that's South Indian state of Kerala. South Indian state of Kerala. Shane, we had a packed weekend regarding stories. The one that as I was reading through that caught my eye probably more than anything else. Yes, we talked about the Trump rent thing. I don't want to beat that into the ground. The sanctions on China, that's something we should go back to. But 5 million cases on Sunday and 165,000 deaths. Wow. Can you imagine if you were that scale is hard to kind of process, that number of people that have passed from an illness like this. But let's do this. Let's jump to the deep stakes. So Kamala Harris, I argue that Kamala Harris will be the person to get the vice president spot. My argument for this almost entirely, came because Joe Biden had a question of whether you're going to pick a lefty or somebody who's African American. And for the longest time, I think the conversation could have been lefty if Joe Biden thought that those were going to be the people who were going to least likely vote for them. But I think after the events recently, and especially with Black Lives Matter and his ability or his want to try to get some of that energy, Joe Biden, I think, was looking for I need a black person in the spot. Up until the point of the protests, Elizabeth Warren might have had a chance. When the protests hit, my thought was, there is no way that Joe Biden is not going to choose somebody like Kamala Harris for that spot. As it went on, I wavered slightly, thinking, "Go, maybe he chooses a lefty if enough lefties stand in kind of distance of him, and if the polls remain tight, and Joe Biden believed that that's the community he needs to get." Right now, though, I'm leaning hard towards Kamala Harris. What do you think about that and the logic of that? I mean, he wants a hook. Kamala Harris doesn't give him a hook. People are like, "Hey, you got to choose a black vice president," as if we haven't already had a black president. And that black president can give 95% of the income to the top 1%. And so I don't get what the blackness of the individual has to do with what they're going to do in regards to the office. And the vice president spot in and of itself is just the stand-in. It's one of the weakest spots in the government. Basically, you're just there in case the president dies. And every so often, the president may tap them to do a job, and every so often you may get the vote in Congress. But basically, you do nothing. But I think what people believe
a lot
is
of
that
people are looking to the VP for that exact reason. Just because if Biden, just real quick, if Biden dies, which a lot of people, have just reason to believe there's a decent chance of happening while he's in, considering the apparent mental degradation and everything. If Biden dies, then that VP is going to be suddenly really important. They're going to, be the president. So
that's true. But we've already had a black president, and I'm not saying I don't. Well, how can I say this? Sounds weird. I don't care one way or the other about getting another one. I care about the policies. And if you put somebody in like Obama, who called himself a Republican, saying if he was back in the 90s, he'd be considered a Republican, I take him at his word. I think from the standpoint of the policy difference, that's what matters. So if you put in somebody like a Sanders as a vice president, I think that's radically different than if you put somebody like a Hillary Clinton in as vice president. I'm using extremes because I'm just trying to give an example. By the same token, in that spot, the vice president can only push the president. He'll be the president's tack dog, but it's not like he's going to have authority in and of himself to do things. People want Kamala Harris as vice president, many, because they want Joe Biden to give something back. And in their heads, choosing a vice president that's African-American is giving something back, missing the point that you've already had a black president. And giving something back has to be done in terms of policy, not in terms of this kind of identity optics nonsense. No, people want real things. And ultimately, putting a Kamala Harris in that spot, a Whitmer in that spot, is basically Joe Biden putting somebody just like him with this idea of continuity of our system with a new face to maintain that continuity. That's why it's like all of these people are like, they're so concerned about the VP spot. And you have a lot of people who are saying it must be Warren. You have other people who are saying it must be this person or it must be that person. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Joe Biden, most of those people who are voting for Joe Biden are terrified of Trump. And Joe Biden could choose a ham sandwich, literally a ham sandwich for his VP spot. And all of those people would still say, okay, and they'll still go and vote for Joe Biden. They'll say, all right, a tack dog ham sandwich is going to have to do a great job in the presidential debates, but that's who we're going with. And they'll say, okay, fair enough. We're still voting Biden. That's so sad. And yet I think it's absolutely entirely true.
It's where we are. Yeah, I mean, the VP pick in that sense doesn't make a difference. I think the real way in which it makes a difference are, one, optically, just in terms of his chances of getting elected, in terms of the team's chances of getting elected. But two, if Biden dies, then the VP is suddenly very important. Now I think they do.
That's grim, but that is fair. Some people may be like, "Oh, that's grim," but that is fair. Let's be, it's not. I think that's not unfair of you kind of making that point.
Totally. And I was having a conversation with a family member actually about politics and stuff, and about she wants Biden, and she was asking me who I thought would be a good VP pick for him. We were talking about the top contenders and stuff, and where I came down is just, I mean, right up front, I'm not planning on voting for him, not planning on voting for Trump either. I am planning on voting, but I'm definitely not planning on voting for Biden, and therefore in that sense, I don't have any skin in the game, I don't have any claim, and I don't really care. But on the other hand, Biden, you're saying the VP doesn't have any power, the president's going to have power. I don't really see Biden having power. I see Biden as being far too afraid, sadly, to have any real agency of his own in the administration. He's going to be a lapdog for whoever he's on his lap, whoever's lap is on his at that point, or whoever's lap he's on. You get what I'm saying? Biden has some tendencies, from what I hear. Anyway, he's an establishment guy, and the VP pick is going to be an establishment person too, and therefore it's just the ticket that you're voting for, and the ticket, the policies, the responses are already pretty well known because they're just going to be the bureaucratic responses that the establishment has. You know what I mean? And it's you can sort of learn to intuit what different parties are going to do at any given point just by watching what they're doing, and pushing for more war, doing more of the same kind of political stuff that we've seen. That's just what I've come to expect. That's all that I think we can expect from the VP pick. And so for me, it can't matter. It's like unless they're an outsized person, unless they're a really great alternative voice in some way, which Biden would never pick, then it's not going to make enough of a difference in terms of what he does or what the administration does if he gets elected to really matter. But we're going to go into a break. We'll be back in a minute. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We will be back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines. My name is Shane Stranahan. I am joined by my co-host, Jamarl Thomas. We are coming to you from across the divided states of America. We're airing live on the radio right now, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in Washington, D.C. That's in the D.C. area, too. Again, 105.5 FM, 1390 AM. We're also on the radio in Kansas City and that area, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Also, you can listen to us online. We're on YouTube and Periscope. Those are our two video platforms. Just go to YouTube and do a search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. And you'll find one of two channels, both broadcasting live every morning, except for that 1 week where Jamarl's channel was temporarily taken down. But that's another issue. That was pretty inexplicable. I've got to say, maybe we can come back to that in a minute and prognosticate again a little bit on hopefully keeping that guy up. We are also playing on audio, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. You can listen to us. And again, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320 is the number to call. So real quick, Jamarl, I'm just going to explain my real complicated thing there for a sec. Actually, not that complicated, but your channel was taken down for like a week there, and then it was put back up. And as far as I can tell, there wasn't like a reasonable explanation for what happened. There was sort of they complained about one video, but they weren't very descriptive about what the problem was, and then they let you back up. Is there like a strike system? Is that like a serious thing?
Yeah, so they have strike systems. Initially, what Google used to do, they used to give you a copyright strike, and they would take your channel down for like 3 months. They didn't have to really answer to you. You could put through an appeal, but the appeal didn't really entirely all that matter because it's a faceless entity. So there's nobody who you can ever talk to in that process. You may get a response back on Twitter every so often, but ultimately you have a faceless entity that you're dealing with. I don't know why a class action suit hasn't already been filed against Google for those type of reasons, right? Like ultimately, you are in a situation where there's an unaccountable entity because there's nothing else like Google. And class action is the wrong word for it. I'm looking for it'll come to me. But the antitrust. Because Google is basically an entity unto itself. And so there was a video that I had up that they say this violates our copyright strikes. And the point I made to them in the appeal was, based on the information I had at the time, this was true. Now, mainstream media can put up something that is basically wrong and wrong for years. And so getting something wrong is not in and of itself enough of a reason for a video to be taken down, especially if it wasn't necessarily intentional. Those things don't really matter to Google, though. I mean, they were taking down items from a war channel because it was talking about war. Imagine one of my favorite history channels, The Great War, had a trouble with Google because they couldn't tell the difference between them talking about history and them talking about violence, because those things are intertwined with one another. And so Google would be digging their videos and censoring some of their content.
That's great.
In this particular case, it was a video they didn't like. Yeah, it was a video they hated. It sucks. I mean, it's not like the videos are, full of Nazis running around. It's not like anything harsh or unfair is being put out. It's nothing like that. And so it's like there should be some level of context when you're looking at a channel to discern what the channel is about and whether or not this is in line with their typical content. Like all that stuff need to be taken into account. But I don't think that stuff is. You have viewers who would look around at your channel. They can find something going back months ago and ding you for something that you did months ago. So it's a little weird and strange when you're functioning on a network where you don't have any control, nor can you see the various people who are making decisions about whatever you're doing. So I would love if there was something else, but to compete with Google.
I mean, they're technically, you can use Vimeo, you can use some of the other platforms, but I get what you mean on the larger sense, especially with not just making money and monetizing your videos, but also just discovery. And so, you post your video. Anybody who posts a similar video, if they have followers, it's likely that yours is going to be included in the recommendations. So as an engine for discovering new video and new channels and subscribing and all that stuff, YouTube is really unparalleled right now. I think that there are some upstart contenders there. Like there are a bunch of these much smaller organizations, but it's really, you want the network effects, and those are super hard to replace. I think what everybody's sort of praying for in terms of people who are pushing for these more open source networks is just that there's going to be a larger exodus at some point, and then most of the people are going to go into at least a few of the larger ones, so that you'll still have some of those network effects, but across these more distributed open networks. Yeah, YouTube. I mean, working with Lee, his channel was taken down permanently, decades, I think, at that point, over a decade, maybe 15, 17 years or something. A long time, like a long track record of posting videos was all just taken down very quickly. I was a part of that process. Like I remember seeing the complaints coming in. And so there's a strike system at that point. I was just curious if that's still
It's aggravating. It really is. This is because you can wake up at any random moment and they're like, we don't like this video. So bam, you're down.
It's true. And there's nothing you can do about it. Like you're saying, the algorithm. I mean, this is a huge issue. And the algorithm thing reminded me, man, we could spend so much time talking about this stuff, because this was mostly my bailiwick before I became the host, and I started to sort of expand my research, get deeper into the wider politics stuff, which I've been following for a while. But you change your perspectives and priorities. But I was very deeply into tech for a long time.
Yeah.
And this has just been reminding me. Have you seen? I think we might have talked about it at one point. Have you seen the GPT-3, GPT-3, the AI stuff? Anything about that? It's very interesting.
What is
it's really interesting. I'm gonna send you some text after the show. But if anybody out there is curious, you can go to Google and do a search for GPT-3. So here's the deal: OpenAI, this tech company based in San Francisco. I know some people who work there. No close friends, but I know I have some acquaintances who have gotten jobs there. They're this AI company that does sort of AI safety research, where they're looking at sort of the boundaries, the conditions that you can set up so that as AI grows in prominence in society, its role is safe and it does safe things. And then if you get one of these scenarios where you have a runaway AI or something that at least is human intelligence or above human or superhuman intelligence or whatever, that you have some parameters that you can maintain on how ethical it is, across many iterations over years of time, where these things could get wildly derailed and suddenly start doing very nasty things very quickly without our being able to prepare for it. So anyway, OpenAI is this org that's been working on it. Elon Musk backed them for how many millions of dollars back in the day, but they have pretty broad funding. So they've been releasing these different generations of AI, and the most recent one is really good. And the only improvement, I mean, they probably have some sort of tweaking improvements on the back end, but the one thing that they did is they really increased the data size. So the previous entry had been something like 1-point-something billion entries. The GPT-3 is 17.5 billion, I think, sort of factual entries that it basically was fed, it harvested from the internet. Anyway, what it does, the way it works, and you can check this out for yourself if you do these searches, it's a sort of text-based for the most part. And the most prominent examples going around, you can create like little interactive adventures. I've seen people doing these little dungeon things, but the most prominent examples are all text-based, where you put in a prompt and then the AI writes from that prompt. So you put in a paragraph or two and sort of setting up a scene or setting up the conditions for what the AI is going to generate. And then you can kind of hit it, and you can adjust how creative it is or how volatile it's going to be or how long it's going to run, these different options. Anyway, you hit the button and it'll basically come up with responses, and they're intelligent. You read them, and some of them are like above the level of writing that you'd expect from even a decent writer in terms of how creative they are. Now, some parts of it are obviously kind of inhuman, but it can take a while, especially for the really good ones, to figure out. It's sort of passing the Turing test in an interesting way. I haven't seen it get this good. And part of the breakthrough here, and why this is a little bit scary to me, is that it's not some sort of weird philosophical advance that they've made. What really made the difference here was just throwing more compute at it, was just throwing more processing power, throwing more time spent on GPUs, throwing more examples. And with the internet, you have a ton more examples than they gave it. And with like the rise of better graphics cards for gaming and for Bitcoin mining and all this different stuff, you have more compute you can throw at it if you wanted to buy those cards up after the chip makers make them. So in other words, we haven't reached the ceiling yet, as far as I can tell. GPT-3 is way better than GPT-2. And if you haven't heard about it, you should definitely check out some examples after the show. It's actually really impressive. Some of the cases.
I would definitely check that out. One of the guys I used to work with used to play with a neural AI thing. Basically, it's trying to create like a neural net of sorts, and he would use it. James was really good at this stuff in the sense that he used to be really curious about all of the new technologies that was coming out that would allow like neural interfacing and that type of stuff. So no, that stuff is utterly and entirely fascinating to me. So definitely send me that. Right now, apparently, that's going on. There is a riot that is taking place in Chicago, and apparently people are looting, mag-mal, smashing windows, and confronting officers. This went all the way until like 5 a.m. apparently, and I'm trying to get more information on it, but what it sounds like is that there was a belief that there was a standoff and that a kid was killed. Now, apparently that didn't happen. This is more than an hour after the shooting. Police and witnesses said a crowd of about 30 people faced off against officers holding a police line near 56 and Aberdeen streets. Authorities said someone fed false information to the angry group, including that the police shot and wounded a child. During the scuffle, one officer was hit with pepper spray and a second officer suffered a minor shoulder injury. 2 people were arrested, and the police car has a shattered brick in the window, a window shattered with a brick. Officers responded to reports of a young with a gun spotted someone who fit the description at Moore Park in 5700 block of South Racine Avenue at 2:30 p.m. He ran away and while was being chased by the police, turned around and fired at them, authorities said. He was then taken to University of Chicago Medical Center, but the condition was not known. This is when it's like more than an hour after the shooting, there was a face-off with the cops. But apparently the malls and whatnot are being basically vandalized and the shops are being ransacked. And this is apparently went all the way into the morning. Yeah, it's I get sick of these, man. Like, because to me this stuff isn't I don't think people in no normal circumstances wake up and say, I want to rob a store. I don't think people do that under normal circumstances. So I have to think, why would they do that? What would motivate somebody to get up and take the energy required to go and loot a store? Is it just society is broken down, so there's this frenzy? Is it that they were already mad and aggrieved and feeling this kind of sense of alienation? So when the first thing pops off, they feel, yes, I'm free, I can do whatever I want, and I'm going to push back, and so I'm going to push back in this particular way. I don't know. I understand the anger and the frustration of the shootings. I get that part. I don't fully and entirely know how that translates to robbing a liquor store, or for that matter, a Nordstrom's. Look, I don't consider that stuff violence. I think that's insane to call it violence. But I do think it's massively problematic. And I do think it is something to ask, why is your society doing this? Shane, sometimes I think we disagree on the protest stuff. But like I said, I'm not a fan of the rioting at all. I'm not a fan of breaking into stores and whatnot. Because the problem is, nobody, hardly anybody, is going to look at what you've done, even if you were right, meaning your impetus, the thing that got you started of that righteous indignation was correct. Nobody's going to say that guy robbed a liquor store because of the shooting. And I don't even think you would want somebody to say that, because that sounds and looks horrendous, that this is the level that people will go. But I don't know what happened in Chicago entirely. I do know that stores are being just looted and trashed. And I don't know what this gives us, to be honest, outside of the stores being looted and trashed. We have about a minute, so might as well take a break now, and we can bring back Margaret Kimberly. It's just aggravating, that's all. I don't want my society doing this. I don't want, and when I say society, I mean the entirety of America. I don't like this, one way or the other. And it's something that we as a society need to grapple with as to why. But we're going to bring on Margaret Kimberly. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And this segment and the next, Margaret Kimberly. She's a senior columnist and an editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. I'll do this before we even bring her on. If you want to follow Margaret on Twitter, you can. Just go to Freedom Ride Blog. I'll say that again, twitter.com/FREEDOMRIDEBLOG, Freedom Ride Blog. Margaret, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming back. So we're talking about Joe Biden, the election today. What do you think? So we're specifically talking about Joe Biden's relationship with the Black community, especially as he goes into a week where many suspect he will choose a Black vice president. What do you see as Biden's real relationship with the Black community at this point? I feel a little bit weird asking that question, especially with a Black co-host, but just go right ahead.
No, Shane, go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
Well, being a Democrat, he will automatically get 90% of the Black vote. That's clear. The question is, what is the turnout going to be for him? And there are so many problems with Biden. The comments he's made recently, asking the Black reporter, "Are you a junkie?" What was the other thing? I don't know. It's so hard to keep up with him.
When he said, "You're not Black," he told the guy, "You're not Black if you're not voting for me."
You're not, right.
In the latest,
you're not Black,
yeah, and he said something recently. That's what he said. The Hispanic community is far more diverse. Talking about basically Blacks and monolithic.
Thank you. Yes,
which, by the way, makes sense from his point of view.
It does to him, but here's the issue. The fact that he says these things tells you what's wrong with Biden. He was never smart. He never was. He always was gaffe prone, is that the term? But now he has some sort of cognitive disability. There's something wrong with him, just to put it in lay people's parlance. And they're hiding him. I think the Democrats are glad that there's a pandemic. They can't have the rallies and the interaction with candidates that you would usually see at this point. The fact that he's not even going to be at the even virtual convention. They're trying to talk him out of attending any debates because they can't trust him to speak. But so the question is, what will the turnout be? I saw a story last week about that Republicans are already doing voter outreach. They're going door to door, and the Democrats don't plan to do that. Well, that's a recipe for disaster. Black people are not, by and large, not going to vote for anybody else, but the question is turnout. And we always have to talk about voter suppression. So I think Biden is vulnerable for a number of reasons. I do not believe these polls. I think we need to take a closer look. I, for one, learned these lessons from 2016. So that's my take on Biden. And as far as picking a Black vice presidential candidate, I'm actually the wrong person to ask because I don't really care. I don't care who his vice presidential candidate is. I'm not sure if the public care that much, but there's been this expectation raised now, and so I feel like he has to do it. But I'm not sure that's going to either Rice or Harris actually help him in that regard either.
Yeah, just broadly, that's exactly where I fall. I don't really care either. Anybody he does, anybody he chooses for that position, it's going to fit the same slot as him. It's just basically an establishment head. But I do feel the need to sort of ask the semi-perfunctory question: who do you think among those, who are candidates for that pick, for the VP pick, who do you think would be best for voter turnout among Black Americans?
I think it's a wash. Harris has a problem. She spent years as a prosecutor bragging about putting people in jail, and many Black people do not like her, actively dislike her, in fact. Rice has a problem. People don't pay as much attention to foreign policy, so she's an unknown entity to most people. Of course, if you start delving into her career and the role she played in Libya and in Congo, a terrible role that got things that the U.S. did that got millions of people killed, she was a part of. So neither one of them helps him at all.
Let me ask you this: do you think Blacks should start their own party? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were still talking. I apologize.
That's okay. No, I think he wants to pick Whitmer. I don't think he really wants to pick either one. But at any rate, as much as we can tell what Biden wants, should Black people start? Everyone must leave the Democratic Party. Everyone.
Yes.
The Democratic
Well, let me explain what I mean by
Party
that. I 1,000% agree with you, but let me explain what I mean. When I look at King of Blacks, Joe Biden, and the way he gallivants as if he owns the Black community, there's nothing that has taken place in 2020, maybe with the exception of Sanders and the way he ran that race, other than Biden claiming Black folks for his own. That's aggravating to me to no end. Especially knowing his history and knowing some of the stuff he used to brag about, and knowing the fact that he lies flagrantly about civil rights issues. So if I look at this and I think Blacks are going to vote for him for like 90%, regardless, meaning without getting anything for that vote, will get that vote to 90%. Is it enough to leave the party? I mean, my idea would be to leave the party and function under this notion of these are the policies that we want. But is it enough to do that from a standpoint of class? Does it also need to be some kind of separate issue that African Americans care about in and of themselves that go beyond the issue of class, which would somewhat necessitate some organization in and of itself to fight for those specific issues? Or should this entirely be about class?
Well, I don't think it should be entirely about class. America is so racist that your race determines what class you're in. So I don't think that helps us very much. I do think, and especially if Biden does lose, the Democratic Party has to go. People must leave, actively leave. You have a party that brags about not giving its members what they want. It's more of a brand at this point. It's like this fundraising arm for Wall Street and big tech, and a branding label that continues to get votes because the other party is further to the right. We have a far-right party and a center-right party. But the Democrats, even when they do get in, don't meet our needs, don't even pretend. And because they don't meet our needs, they can't even get into office. So here you have Trump has this opportunity to give the appearance of moving to the left with this executive order about the unemployment insurance because of the Democrats' allegiance to their donor class, who will not allow them to do anything that people want them to do. So in a pandemic, we have the same crappy healthcare system, or a non-system, as I like to say. It's why the U.S. has had so many deaths, but they are stuck. They have said they're not going to do Medicare for all. They're not going to give us what we need. So the Democratic, I think black people, unfortunately, will be the last ones to leave the Democratic Party, because our politics now have been shrunk down to nothing but keeping Republicans out of office. So there will be a lack of trust and a fear of doing anything else. But this is how we've gotten to this point, where there really isn't there is no black polity allowed. And when we're happy with just seeing black faces in high places and having a black president, but being afraid to assert any of our needs, this is what we've come to. People in the Democratic Party, including Barack Obama, foisted this awful man with this terribly racist history upon us.
Are you talking about Joe Biden there? No, I think you were talking about Trump.
Yes, I am. Yes.
No, no. I mean, one quick response. I've been thinking for a while, probably hopelessly naively, out of hopeless naivete, that you could see a broad base support for something like reparations, whatever, and I can get into specifics, but on the left as well as the right, among Democrats as well as Republicans. But I think that you're right. I think that there's some sort of major shift, some major breakdown and recreation that needs to happen on a party basis, probably on both sides, but we can just stick to the Democrats for a second. On the right, real quick, the form I could see this taking is, I mean, in a weird way, if you go back, I've talked about this on air before, a couple of times before. If you go back to the 60s, the 70s, up through today, a lot of the outsourcing, a lot of the offshoring, a lot of the major shift in manufacturing and the basis of the American economy, the demographics that hit hardest were Black Americans. You know, one of the most prominent demographics that were relying on these jobs, both existing ones and a lot more new ones coming into place, were already relatively poor Black Americans coming out of segregation, post-civil rights era. And that totally denuded a lot of the opportunities, and what you got instead was, serious decades of problems, which we're still, obviously living in today. So I could see, in a weird way, I'm making a manufacturing argument for it, where if you brought manufacturing back to the United States, you could make that a Republican talking point, and then you could genuinely push for policies and programs that would help, especially Black Americans, and you could do that going forward. I know that might be coming out of completely nowhere. That might sound hopelessly naive. You can look at the history of racism on the right, but there's also a history of racism on the left with the Democrats too. I don't know. I'm just, as an attempt, my point there is, going back to the first point of whether Black Americans should have their own party, I think it would be better if you tried to shift the Overton window in some way so that both parties were actually able to advocate for Black Americans, so that it wasn't any longer a politicized racial divide. And I could see if you reconsolidated the parties in some way, if by voice or exit, however you wanted to do it, whether it was reform or recreation, if you shaped the way that the parties worked so that they were a little bit more adequate, I could see that being and becoming a broad enough base issue. But what's your take on that, Margaret? Is that just hopeless? Is that too idealistic?
I don't think that's going to happen. You are absolutely right. The loss of living wage work has been devastating to the country as a whole, and to Black people even more so. But I think what we need a complete. We need to talk about and organize around a new movement, which does not depend on the electoral system. We're still too dependent. Even if we talk about another political party, we're still talking about electoral politics. I think we need to be in movement and, for the most part, ignore electoral politics. And I'm not saying don't register to vote or even don't vote, but why did we lose living wage jobs? Because there was a decision at the top. Finance capital said manufacturing capital can go overseas. We don't need it. No, they didn't need it. We needed it, though. So now we have the rich still getting richer, people suffering terribly, but these stimulus bills helping the wealthy more than they did the working people who don't even have the little bit of now the extra $600 is gone. That is what we need to fight against. There has to be more mutual aid networks. There has to be a recognition that we have got to help each other because the system is not going to. We must stop voting for these terrible people. We must stop voting for Democrats. If you want to be in the electoral system, you got to start voting for different people. You have to actively run against them. Even the DSA, when push comes to shove, they will go along with, we just have to keep Republicans out of office. So I think we have to think entirely out of the box, how to have, as the slogan says, power to the people, real power to the people, control over our lives. We talked a lot the last few months about community control of the police. We need community control over every aspect of our lives. The billionaire class are deciding what does and doesn't happen to us. Some of them are getting us into the verge of a hot war with China and or Russia. So we have got to find new ways of moving politically that don't depend on electoral politics. Electoral politics are not going to save us.
That is the voice of Margaret Kimberly. Margaret, we can maybe continue that specific conversation on a future movement when we come back. We're going into a break right now. But again, the eloquent, confident voice of Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined for this segment, continuing our conversation in the last, by Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. Real quick note, you can follow Margaret on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog. Those three words all put together, nothing in between. Freedom Ride Blog. Margaret, thanks again for joining us. I want to pick up pretty much exactly where we left off. You were closing off with a couple of comments about building back community power, basically, and the breakdown of political systems and how you see electoral politics as, at this point, I believe, largely a waste of time. Please feel free to clarify if I got that incorrectly. But what does that look like to you? This is something that excites me very deeply, but I just want to get into the sort of nitty-gritty of it. What are you interested on that local community level? What efforts do you see as exciting right now? What's your take on that?
Well, there are people across the country who are engaging in what we call the solidarity economy, all kinds of co-ops, food co-ops, workers co-ops, childcare co-ops, all kinds of things. We live in a failed state, and we have to acknowledge that and stop acting as though everything, the normal we had pre-COVID wasn't serving our needs anyway. So we don't want to go back to that. We have to find ways of making demands. That is more important. It's equally important as voting. It is just as important. And you get what you want if they know they can't get away with it. You know, we've seen something interesting. I did make a little snide remark about DSA, but we've seen some upsets here in New York where some old guard politicians, some state legislators lost to the recent Democratic primary when some new folks came in, people who had money behind them. And that just goes to show you there is not satisfaction with these people in office. It can be done. We can get rid of some of these old people. We can act. But it's going to be hard because it's been decades since any of this has been done. And the spontaneous protests have their place, but you can't depend on that. There has to be organization, teach-ins, some kind of education so that people can relearn. The people who were around in the late 60s, early 70s, some of them are still around to help us along this path. But I see more of a people-centered, people-controlled movement that is the only thing that is going to save us. These people that we go and vote for, we cannot depend on them to save us.
This puts me in the line of Ralph Nader. Nader had made this basic argument that if you want anything accomplished politically, you need a group of people in each state that can basically compel their politicians to come and create this kind of active engagement. And it can't be part-time. Like, you can't have a part-time push for X or for Y. It has to be something that the person wakes up in the morning and dedicates himself to doing in order to get something like that passed. For the people who were back in the 50s, 60s, 70s that were pushing for the civil rights movement, is there something new or is there something different in the way that people can go about their protests? Or is it basically relearning what people did back then in order to push for something like a human rights movement, that it goes beyond this notion of the specific identity itself? I guess I'm asking because I agree with you. I think leaving the politicians in office and going with the blue no matter who nonsense, and we'll vote for whatever thing, and incrementalism and least worse, I think all of these things were excuses just for Democrats to slide to the right and getting the public to basically vote for any random blue. Meaning, by having Republicans to be what they are, the Democrats basically make an argument that we're least worse and we're the most pragmatic choice because we're least worse, allowing the party to fly as fast as possible to the right, taking loads of money and doing all of these policies that are in the interests of the Republicans while simultaneously talking like they were back in the era of FDR. We've took our eye off the ball in some respects. And in doing so, put people in office where we weren't necessarily paying attention and holding them accountable to any particular standard. How do we bring them back to a standard? And is it really just looking back at the techniques that took place back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s? Or is there something new that can take place to kind of energize and galvanize a large number of people to have their eye on the ball outside of the political space and trying to assert what they want from the standpoint of the demands?
Well, let's talk about one thing in the 60s. Let's talk about, everybody wants to fetishize the civil rights movement without talking about what really happened and what really was achieved. Millions of people in mass action over a period of years. People who could not vote are the ones who guaranteed the right to vote, who are the ones who made discrimination illegal. I'm not saying it disappeared, but they at least Jim Crow was over, and it was sustained. And there was a very simple point: give us the vote, end discrimination. We have to have very simple ideas of what we are fighting against. Save the planet. Climate change is going to kill us before any of these other things do. So I think we need to focus very clearly on some specific ideas. Healthcare, free healthcare for everyone. We raise the minimum wage. All of these things, if people act in tandem, people have talked about a general strike. I don't think Americans, frankly, even people on the left, know enough to have a successful general strike. But I think it is very important that we talk about it. I think it's very important that these conversations begin.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
I think
you said the people on the left, you don't think they will be able to accommodate a general strike. What do you mean? Be specific.
Well, I don't know how many people know what a general strike is. And I think you have to have a serious, really tight organizing in order to pull that off, for everyone to just stay home and not go to work and not buy anything. That requires a level of knowledge and organization that we just don't have yet. But it's something that I would love to see, something we need to have. In Oakland earlier this year, a group of women who were homeless just occupied some houses that some developers were, what developers do, building property to sell it at a high price, and they just moved in. And we have homeless encampments all over the country. Move into these houses, just go. I think things like that is what I would like to see, and I think that will do a lot. Once you have a victory, then there's more confidence that more change can come about. But I think people are now fixated on the presidential election, and that of course always happens at this point every 4 years. But I have a fear of Biden winning and people just letting their guard down completely and saying, "Oh, thank God Trump is gone," and thinking there's nothing for them to do. and thinking everything is okay, and blaming everything on Trump as if there was no homelessness before Trump got in office, or there were living wage jobs before Trump got in office, or that people didn't go broke because they got sick before Trump got into office. These are things that have to happen regardless of the outcome in November if we are going to survive with any human rights and any dignity at all. But I think the education and the organizing has to start now.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I mean, because I do think that we've dedicated so much energy to the political system that we've taken our eye off of these other elements of our environment that we use to work with. Like you said, sit-ins, you have dollars or pitchforks. And for the longest time, you've only had dollars. The pitchforks come outside of the political system, even though there's an aspect, to which they intervene into it. So no, I agree with you entirely on this. I also agree with you with a certain terror that the moment that the election happens, that the protests that were taking place, that people, they say, oh, finally, a Democrat has taken it. We can now rest. And everything else kind of goes away and the energy kind of just subsides. I even think that at the end of it, for Black Lives Matter, that stuff is going to start to get ignored by media the moment that Joe Biden takes office. I think a lot of this stuff is going to take place, and I don't think those things are necessarily going to be positive. What do you think? Prognosticate for me for a moment. Biden wins. What's the presidency of Joe Biden? And is this just an Obama presidency or a Clinton presidency? Meaning the things that the public actually needs and the things that the public actually wants. Joe Biden has been so brazen to tell people to go vote for somebody else, which means that he understands the mechanism of you having nowhere else to go. And he understands it in this kind of brazen way where he would tell you overtly, yeah, go vote for the other guy. Go vote for the other guy. Which means that your ability to get anything accomplished in the political space goes up in smoke the moment that the candidate doesn't care about what you want, and flagrantly will tell you openly that he doesn't care about what you want. Like, this is a horrible degradation of the political system. How do we dig ourselves out of this? And I know you said the movement and everything else, but do you see that on the horizon? Even with the number of people who are going to lose their jobs and everything else, do you see what you are thinking about? And do you see what you're talking about in regards to what needs to take place in our political system for people to be made whole and for people to, push for something that's for the betterment of all humanity? Do you see the budding aspects of that in our political space? And if so, what are they? And by the way, one more question. Well, with the rioting that's taking place, there's a riot right now in Chicago. How do you feel about that when you see that? In fact, ignore the other question. Let's go to that one because we only have about 2 minutes left. When you see the people looting the stores in Chicago and whatnot, taking out whatever they're taking out based on what's supposed to happen, basically a shooting or something, or with a confrontation with the cops, how do you feel about that? And how do you frame that when you're looking at an event like that?
Well, I did not know this had taken place. I'm going to be honest. I had only been up about 20 minutes before you called me. And when I heard you talking about it, I looked up and saw it. I didn't know this was going on. I think that some of it is opportunistic. Somebody's protesting something, and there's always going to be a person or person who starts to smash and grab. That's always going to happen. But I think this is an indication of anger about many other things. It says there was a police-involved shooting. People are very, very angry about police violence, the fact that nothing has changed, and people need to, speaking of demands, our demand has to be for community control of the police, as in all other aspects of our lives, not defunding the police, not any other BS. We've got to have community control over police. Young teen was shot by police in Chicago. The Democratic mayor and others covered it up for nearly 2 years. They had the video showing that the shooting was not justified, and people are still angry about that. And when you have that underlying anger, you're going to have some property damage too. But I'm not going to condemn that outright. You do have to be one. I'm not telling anybody to do it because the state will drop the hammer. on certain people who do things that I consider relatively minor. But I am not surprised that this would happen. In Chicago, a city that clearly is in need of very fundamental political change. You've had the high rate of shootings, just criminal shooting, the police being out of control, the fact that they had a secret prison in Chicago, Holman Square.
30.
People were kept from their attorneys, and this went on for years.
We've got to go.
So we've got to
go. Hopefully we can get you back on soon and continue this conversation. For those listening, you've been listening to Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report, also an author. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Coming to you live from the divided states of America for our last hour this Monday morning. You're listening to the most disruptive radio show in the U.S. In the politically independent corner, I am Shane Stranahan, your intrepid radio show host.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, with my co-host, of course, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Getting back into it, let's go to top headlines. Quick note here, we do these every morning 3 times at 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern. That's 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. That's my time. I am on the West Coast. Jamarl's on the East Coast. Just for those listening, you know, that's while we're at a studio. Usually we're based in Washington, D.C., where you can hear us on the radio, possibly right this second, in fact, if you're listening that way. Regardless, though, we're going to get into headlines here. Trump signed 4 executive orders on Saturday, one giving $400 per week in unemployment benefits, one giving a payroll tax deferral for employees, one which promises to temporarily halt some evictions which, quote, are reasonably necessary to prevent the further spread of COVID-19, end quote, and one extending student loan relief from September 30th until the end of the year. The deferral on employee payroll taxes lasts until the end of the year. It's 6.2% for Social Security and 1.4% for Medicare. And Trump has said that he plans to forgive those taxes and make permanent cuts to payroll taxes if he is reelected. Meanwhile, the $400 a week unemployment payment would be partly paid for by the federal government and partly paid for by states, although on Sunday, Trump said that if states made requests for the federal government to recover the remainder, they would review the case and possibly cover it. That remainder, by the way, is 25%. So of the weekly $400, states are expected to pay for 100 of that. Also, Democrats are pushing back on this. Democrats are some calling this unconstitutional, calling for legal scrutiny of this. That is the main concern here. The only one of these 4 executive orders, and technically this one's a memorandum, is that's sort of iron-bound and actually pretty secure, is the education order, the one that extends student loan relief from September 30th until the end of the year. The others are more ambiguous and susceptible to legal dispute. In our next headline, though, on Friday, the United States slapped sanctions on officials in Hong Kong and China, specifically on Hong Kong's Governor Carrie Lam and on Luo Huining, the head of China's liaison office in Hong Kong, also 9 other officials. Hong Kong on Saturday released a statement in response calling the sanctions shameless and despicable, and accusing U.S. officials of ignoring the rule of law in order to make, quote, unsubstantiated and sweeping comments to serve their own interests, end quote. On yesterday, prominent Hong Kongese businessman, publisher, and owner of the Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, was arrested for collusion with foreign powers under the security law put into effect on June 13th. The United States has passed 5 million cases over the weekend, standing now at about 5,200,000 cases and over 165,000 deaths. It was about 165,600 and something last I saw a couple hours ago this morning. Brazil, meanwhile, has passed 100,000 deaths On Sunday, Australia had its deadliest day yet with 17 deaths. Meanwhile, New Zealand has hit 100 days without community transmission. In Virginia, rent memoriams began today. This will be going until September 7th. This follows a decision by Virginia Supreme Court to grant Governor Ralph Northam the ability to suspend evictions following a request on July 24th. So that is happening on the state level. Of course, Trump's order was on the federal level. It's interesting to see the competition of powers, between the local and between the state and the federal government. And this crisis, I think, is going to be a big test of them. So that was in Virginia. In Texas, Attorney General Ken Paxton, meanwhile, released a letter with non-binding legal guidance saying that local officials in Texas don't have the legal authority to impose rent memoriams. He wrote that while local officials do possess certain emergency powers, statewide eviction procedures far exceed the requirement that those powers be exercised on an appropriate local scale, end quote. This non-binding legal guidance, by the way, follows decisions last month by the mayor of Austin and the judge for Travis County to extend eviction moratoriums until September 30th. So here's where you have this sort of conflict between local and state government. I'm just pointing out in Texas, you have this interesting thing where local governments are trying to do moratoriums, and they're doing them as far as I can tell. And then the AG for the state is saying, no, you shouldn't be doing that. It's outside your powers. Then on the federal level, you have this interesting, not a contest exactly, but Virginia has sort of successfully done this with the Supreme Court granting the governor the ability. Meanwhile, the president has passed this executive order, which to everybody else seems much more tenuous. We'll see how that goes. I'm just pointing out the interesting sort of scale here from top to bottom, large to small, between the political powers. In our next story, presidential candidate Joseph R. Biden Jr. is expected to choose his VP running mate, with Kamala Harris widely put in that top slot. But Willie Brown, the first black mayor of San Francisco, has encouraged Kamala Harris to say no to a Biden VP pick and instead go for an AG pick, an attorney general pick. That, of course, would match her position in San Francisco. Other leading candidates for the VP pick are former UN Ambassador Susan Rice and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. In our next story, the motorcycle festival Sturgis is ongoing in the city of Sturgis, South Dakota. Almost 500 people are attending there in total. The event will be going on until Sunday, this coming Sunday. The state itself, and by the way, most people there aren't wearing face masks. That's the, if you look at pictures and you see the reporting on it, at least, maybe there's some, maybe that, they were selectively chosen photos and maybe the reporting on it is wrong, just throwing that in there. But from what I've seen, it seems like most people there are definitely not wearing masks, and I'm worried about the spread of this, of course. The state has had a total of 9,605 cases and 146 deaths. Also in South Dakota news, in the New York Times, according to an unnamed Republican official, the White House reportedly had an aide reach out to the governor of South Dakota about having Trump added to Mount Rushmore. So this follows, actually the first, I'll start it this way. I'm going to swap the headline around from the way I have it written. Back when they first met, apparently, shortly after he won, Trump, when he met with Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota, he raised the topic that it had always been his dream to have his face on Mount Rushmore. He brought it up. That's according to her. Then last year, an aide reached out to their office asking about this. Then on the 4th of July this year, Trump was given a replica of Mount Rushmore by Kristi Noem, and his face was on it. So his head had been added to Mount Rushmore. When asked about the question of whether or not they had formally submitted this through the aide, the White House didn't refuse it. They said that they had sent they didn't refuse that they had sent the request. They didn't respond to that directly. They did say that Mount Rushmore was a federal and not a state monument, however. In our next story, the largest earthquakes since the year 1916 have hit North Carolina on Sunday morning at around 8 a.m. local time, when an earthquake with a magnitude of 5.2 hit just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. On Sunday, Saudi Arabia limited the volume of crude oil it sends to America for the second time in 3 years, with tankers of oil down from almost daily deliveries to ones delivered about once a week, less than once a week over the last few months. In Lebanon, 2 government ministers have resigned amid protests following last week's explosion in Beirut. That explosion led to at least 158 people being killed, over 6,000 injured, potentially many tens or hundreds of thousands of people homeless. Lebanon's information minister Manal Abdel Samad announced her resignation, criticizing Prime Minister Hassan Diab's government. Shortly after, Environment Minister Damianos Khader also resigned from his post. France and the United Nations led a virtual donor conference in the aftermath of that explosion, pledging together nearly $300 million in humanitarian assistance to be, quote, directly delivered to the Lebanese population, end quote. Over in Belarus, protests erupted late last night after early election results showed Alexander Lukashenko winning re-election with an 82% majority against his main rival, opposition candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who said in a news conference late Sunday night that she did not agree with the results. The night before the election, Tikhanovskaya's campaign said she had fled her apartment out of safety concerns. Meanwhile, live feeds in the capital on Sunday showed riot police using tear gas and stun grenades to disperse protesters there. In the last story this morning, at least 18 people were killed and more than 120 were injured after a plane skidded off a runway in the South Indian state of Kerala. The plane was carrying people returning to India after being stranded abroad due to the coronavirus pandemic. That is a harsh way to return. I'll just put it that way. Feeling sorry for those folks. Those are the headlines. That is the news, our top news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So we're taking calls over the next 20 minutes. Headlines ran a bit long this morning. There are a lot of headlines wrapping up from the weekend, but we're taking them for the next 20 minutes until about 9:30 Eastern, at which point we're going to be interviewing Jareth Kopis about Ukraine, Igor Darchenko, Victoria Nuland, a lot of stuff, some of which we talked about last Friday when we had Leon talking about Russiagate and the history there. But we actually have a caller in now. If you want to call, you can, 202-521-1320. But right now we have Eric calling in from New Jersey. Eric, what's going on?
Hi. I just wanted to, the last interview you did, they were talking general strikes and how to get the American population more class-oriented, especially enough to be able to do that kind of stuff education-wise. But the other part is pointing them in the right direction and getting the ball rolling in that kind of way. And what I've noticed with these protests is that, you know, it's always a reaction to some harm done to them on site, so we're like in their own communities. And so really what we're getting is a reactive protest instead of a proactive protest. Now, in the civil rights movement, they planned and traveled to areas where they knew they would get the largest amount of media play, the biggest backlash, and the most dramatic action taken against them. Mind you, peacefully, but they knew, of the, police predators that existed in certain regions, and they knew how to provoke them into making the civil rights case point for them. My suggestion in this new era would be to take it, since this is a class thing, and most of the monsters are 1% who have captured the government, is to take it to the 1% neighborhoods, such as like the suburbs of Palo Alto, like Atherton, or, the homes of the Wall Street bankers, like Bronxville, or practically all of Westchester County, the Hamptons, Old Greenwich, Connecticut, Palm Beach, Florida, Great Falls, Virginia, University Park, Highland Park, Texas, the village of Indian Hill in Ohio, and all these other places where basically these people have been untouched and really have been able to do everything that they want to do without consequence. You take that to their homes, and suddenly there's going to be a talk about class. And I think that right there might spark the civil rights kind of strategy towards a more class-oriented movement.
I could see that. Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I have my own qualms about. I'm not going to take too much time to Terry on my own qualms, but I have my own qualms about protest as a primary form of political adjustment or political change. But I hear what you're saying. I think you're right about this being more of a reactive than a proactive movement. Of course, the big question is, can it turn into a proactive movement? And then one last point on your specific recommendation about going to people's homes and protesting there. I mean, I can see that as a political strategy. It gets pretty personal, and I think that escalates things along a dimension that doesn't necessarily achieve direct policy change. And I mean, another way of looking at it is that anybody in those communities you've listed, they have other homes, so it's probably not like you're blockading them in there. They can leave, But I understand that you're trying to sort of take it directly to impact the people who are seen as doing the most harm within that system. I don't know, Jamarl, what's your take?
I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I think the point is, when you guys get very angry about some kind of injustice that takes place, you tear up your own community. And in tearing up your own community, what value does it have to destroy your own community? Like many of the people, many of the shops, those are people who are basically in the same boat that you're in. The guy at the bakery that you just destroyed probably gave out bread to that community for God knows how long. Or the person who's selling whatever was already probably under stress from having something like Amazon in effect. And now you've just pretty much destroyed that particular business. I get the righteous indignation. I get the righteous anger. I even get being angry and alienated that your society has deemed you to be in a lesser class. For example, when I was younger, let's say 16, 17, when I first was diagnosed with kidney failure, if you're ill, what do? You don't have the money to get a job. You don't have the money to get insurance. And so you're stuck in this kind of weird donut hole where the moment that you work, you automatically lose your ability to pay for your other things like healthcare and so forth. It means that you're stuck in this thing of poverty under no fault of your own, especially if your parents were already poor. Same thing with family members who weren't necessarily born with all of the mental things intact and would never have been able to get a decent job that could pay a decent living. And so he's stuck in this thing of poverty. I get the anger at that. The catch becomes, how do you dispense that? And how do you dispense that in a way that actively changes your environment? I agree with the caller. A lot of this has been reactive. And it needs to get to this point where it's pointed, very specific, with certain demands that are outside the political space. I do believe in protests. I don't necessarily know if I believe in rioting, but I do believe in protests. By the same token, the entire point of a protest has a threat of a riot built into it just by the action of all those people built together. And I am not of mind that if a government reneges on a social contract, that the public should also stand by that contract. So let's do this. Let's go into a break. We'll be still taking callers. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Do you have access to a radio? Yeah, it's me, Max Kaiser. I'm here with Stacey Herbert. We have a new show on Sputnik called Double Down. It's business, finance, economics, ka-ching, fling, and everything in between. That's Double Down on Sputnik. Tune in.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Shane Stranahan, Jamarl Thomas. I got the order opposite that time there. It's usually Thomas and Stranahan, but you get the point. Our names actually don't matter. They're not in the title of the show. We just do it for continuity. Anyway, that was a little bit awkward, but hey, I like to do those things sometimes. It breaks the fourth window. You can listen to us on the radio in DC 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City 102.9 and 104.7 FM. And 1140 AM. You can listen to us online if you want to as well. By audio, we're on Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Music. By video, you can catch us on YouTube and on Twitter on Periscope. On YouTube, just search for Fault Lines Radio and Jamarl Thomas. We have two separate channels live on both. Jamarl's has video, though, so you might want to go check that. On Twitter, just go to twitter.com/faultlinesradio. You'll see the live Periscope right up at the top there. It works pretty well. And again, we're taking calls this segment 202-521-1320. One brief thing before we go to Michael in Milwaukee. I said the fourth window. It should be the fourth wall, but isn't it actually kind of a window? Like a one-way window?
A wall. No, I think it's a wall.
No, it's a wall, but here's my point. Like,
if you're in a comic book,
actually a one-way window, isn't that, you know what I mean? Like a pass-through window where you can see it from one way, but it's a wall from the other way. I think that's where my mind went there. I think it was a justified Freudian slip, and I petitioned that we change the phrase.
No, you're not wrong, but you do it all the time. You break the wall all the time. Like when Daredevil, not Daredevil, I'm sorry. What is his name? The comic book character. I can see his face. But when Deadpool,
yes.
Right. When Deadpool is having like a conversation and he looks to the audience and says something, that's not even a wall, that's a dimension. I mean, like, he's basically, like, if I was writing a computer program what are the dimensions in the program itself? What do the characters in that program understand the reality to be? And then it's like you have this extra reality that's leaping out somewhere that is beyond whatever that particular thing is. That's kind of what Daredevil is doing.
Totally.
Keep calling him Daredevil. Deadpool realizes that there's a reality out there beyond the reality that he's in. And in doing so, you can make a case that none of this matters because he knows that this is not the real thing. It's fascinating. We think about it in those terms. But yeah, it's also, like a dimension.
Yeah, also, I mean, just briefly, it's like him as a sort of ironic outgrowth of the era of comics, like looking at himself. Again, the sort of self-referential, speaking through the fourth wall, like breaking the narrative. It's just interesting to see that as a generational response in arts, different kinds of arts. But in any event, I feel like it's healthy to do. You want to add that dimension. And it is a dimension of like continuity with the audience, and different media forms represent different. You can do it different ways, and it really is a dimension where you can get closer. Type of media, how you consume media, how it affects you, and the degree of connectedness that you feel with it. But that is completely esoteric and not what we're taking calls about. We're probably taking calls about anything: politics, 202-521-1320, media, culture, whatever you want to talk about, you can. We have Michael in Milwaukee calling right now. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Awesome. Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate it. A couple of things. First, about Frank Nitti. I don't know. Have you guys heard of Frank Nitti?
Nope.
He is a Milwaukee man.
I don't think so.
He led a lot of protests in Milwaukee, actually. But he is marching to D.C. physically 30 miles a day in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. He's doing it. He is streaming live on Facebook and various other things, but he's actually marching, physically doing it.
And what is his name again? Give me his name one more time.
Sure. Frank Nitti, Nitty.
Okay.
I just want to be clear here. This is not the Frank Nitti where I've found the Frank Nitti that you're talking about, and he does not seem to be the same person as Franklin Sessions, American professional basketball player for the A Basketball League. I'm not going to try to pronounce that, but anyway, it's a different person, right?
Right. No, different person.
Okay.
I don't know. He's been on the news, I guess, but I haven't seen him on any progressive shows that I watch. So I was just wanting to get the word out about Frank Nitti, a fellow Milwaukeean. That's not what we call ourselves. Anyway, second thing I wanted to talk about, the DNC is not, with the DNC not coming to Milwaukee.
Wait, Michael, I'm really sorry. This is a little bit too late to interrupt and ask this, but what do you call yourselves? That really begs the question. What is the sort of Milwaukeean self-term of definition? What is the term?
We're Wisconsinites.
Okay, thank you. Please go back. Thank you.
So, economic impact of the DNC not coming to Milwaukee is huge to us in Milwaukee. I mean, we were building hotels like crazy, bed and breakfast, Airbnbs were being booked like crazy. People were ready to take vacations, planning all this economic impact and the money that was going to come into the city. I mean, we have Summerfest, State Fair, which are two huge festivals, and the DNC were all planned for this summer, which it's like if the Super Bowl, the World Cup, and the Wimbledon Open was all in one city in the same year. It's that kind of economic impact. So I just wanted to be known that it really keeps us all here.
Basically,
I know the COVID thing. I understand why it's the times, but
Michael, thank you for the call, man. I'm going to check out Frank Nitti. Yeah, I'm definitely going to check him out. That's fascinating to me, and I'm glad that somebody's doing it. I would love for all of these guys to get together, like the People's Campaign, maybe some of the unions. Like, I think there does need to be something else outside the political space. And the catch is, how do you organize it in a way that makes sense and where this energy is not kind of just wasted into other areas? We have another call, Adam in Colorado. Before I get to Adam, though, Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai should be arrested. He just should. I don't know how you make an argument against it. Basically, you have a person who's in another country, well, you have, let's say in China, and he's working with Pompeo. He's working with some of these people with the United States, and in doing so to undermine the Chinese government. Hong Kong is part of China. Hong Kong was going to be closer aligned with China over the 50-year time period that they were supposed to be reintegrated from being taken by Britain. But the idea that this is some kind of negative, look, I don't live there. And so my opinions are going to be somewhat different. But if somebody was in the United States and that person was actively going into some other country and actively talking to the leaders of that other country to deal with quote unquote pro-democracy knife wielders and people who were setting cops or police stations on fire, yeah, I think I would have the same impression of this guy's a traitor. At the very least from the country to which the person is operating. This is like Juan Guaido. If Juan Guaido is in your country, he's working with the United States to undermine the government of the country in order to implant or get implanted as a ruler of a country over the wishes of the public, I am going to think the exact same thing. Meaning, when I look at the Jimmy Lai case and I see the national security law, well, that's specific to Lai because of what Lai was doing in that country. But the United States would also take grave issues with somebody doing what Lai was doing in Hong Kong. That's why I look at this and think, well, yeah, of course he's going to be arrested for that. I'm shocked he wasn't arrested prior. But he will be prosecuted now. Not saying right, wrong, anything in between. I'm just saying under the context of their own laws, it makes all the sense in the world. Shane, do you want to respond to that before I go to Adam?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, real quick. I mean, under the context of the new rules, sure, but that's what everybody's protesting. So as of June 30th, sort of all hell has broken loose, as far as I can tell, yeah, in the diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China and Hong Kong, but really China. And that kind of makes sense. The U.S. had been engaging in this campaign to support separatists, as far as I can tell, in Hong Kong. There was this 50-year pledged agreement that China had been trying to accelerate. And then the U.S., again, tried to support the movement that was pushing for independence from China, sort of in response to that acceleration. I'm sure that acceleration was itself due to plenty of things that Washington has done. We've talked about the Spratly Islands and other disputes in the South China Sea. I'm sure some of the details of the conversations are reserved for private rooms. But
right.
But just looking at it from the surface level, I don't know. I can judge this from the realpolitik standpoint, or I can judge this from the moral standpoint. Or from the moral standpoint, I grow up in a society that makes me feel, at least on a surface, sort of superficial level, that you shouldn't put people into prison for consorting with foreign powers. Heck, I work for a Russian radio show. Even if unless it's literal treason, unless it's something like outright sabotage, if all you're doing is talking to people, even heads of state from other nations or whatever, and even if you're doing things that are dissident within your country, my moral sense as an American is, hey, you should be allowed to do that to some extent. There should be quite a bit of latitude.
Is that wait? Is that really your moral sense as an American? Like, if you were a millionaire, let's say you were wildly wealthy, and you were in America, you were having conversations in Russia with, I don't know, Vladimir Putin or I can't think of the foreign minister's name, Sir Lavrov, I think his name, and you came back and you started using your money to give to people who were pushing for, let's say, separation of some state. And you get to the point where you have protesters who are stabbing cops. Well, right, that's the parallel. I mean, Lai was supporting the stuff.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That's the thing, but there's no real parallel. So because again, there isn't a parallel. There's not a state that was broken away from the United States, 150 years ago, approximately.
Yeah.
And then held in
abeyance
and that, et cetera. There's no direct parallel, so I can't say that. There's this question of whether Hong Kong deserves statehood after like the century or so of independence, but I mean, not even real independence, because again, British colony. Hey,
they were
but still, there's this question about whether that builds a nation unto itself and whether that nation should be granted rights, et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of far afield. My point is that was my moral take, but I don't really care.
Right.
That's my realpolitik take, which is what ends the day. Is hey,
I guess
it's another country. They're doing this. Go ahead.
Like, I don't think there's a moral take on this, if that makes sense. I mean, like when I look at this, I don't want people in prison. I just don't like it. I think the idea that you're putting people in a cage to me is abhorrent. Are there some cases where people should be? Yes. So, fair enough. But when I look at a country and I think to myself, what's treasonous? Yes, we're on a Russian radio station, but our goal in this is try to push our country into a better spot. And being on mainstream media doesn't necessarily allow us to do that, because we can't point to certain things and say, we need to stop that. We need to be a better country. We need to do X or Y. But if any of us was in a situation where we were using funding, potentially from another government or maybe even from our own, to stir up protests, and to not just protests, riots, where cops are getting killed or cops are getting stabbed and shot, police stations are being burned down, et cetera, then I do think at that point you're trying to have a separatist movement within the country that goes beyond just a dissident. So I mean, I do think at a certain point the country is going to respond just by definition of it being a country and wanting to maintain its own sovereignty.
Of course. Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
And that's what we can that's where mechanically, like, I can look at it from that perspective. My point is just, we're talking about a business person being arrested and the details of that. And so a person who sort of situates myself in that country from my cultural perspective, that's the moral judgment I have, which is some evidence of something. It might not be evidence for what that country should be doing, but it's probably evidence about what our country should be doing, even if it's an infinitesimal little bit of evidence in terms of my one perspective. But it doesn't necessarily apply to China. It might from a deeper human level, where if you're talking about human rights or the course of the world or these larger things, but we should be very suspicious of the U.S. or any government, frankly, using sort of grand moral imperatives to try to drive change, each in their own self-serving way. You should probably go into a break, though. Any quick response, or are you cool if we just go to Jareth?
No quick response. I enjoy that. I agree with that part. So let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with Jareth Kopus, bio author of Ukraine Forever Upon. We'll be back in a moment. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan.
I got no Jareth.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Telling the untold.
Yo, Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development.
Hey, let's just bring in Adam. Yeah. Let's go to Adam.
Any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Let's do this real quick. Let's go to Adam from Colorado. Sorry for holding you over the break. Thank you for staying with us. Adam, what's on your mind?
So one of the things I was thinking of was specifically comments that you regularly make about basically both sides working together, as if there's some mythical middle that should be strived for, that we should have middle ground. But that isn't exactly true. The truth is the truth. What policies should be striven for are the policies that should be striven for. They are not on the left, not on the right. Every once in a while, the right gets the actual information right, and we
Jareth, please hold. We're going to have you with your segment momentarily, okay?
have many of the policies we should be going for. And by that, I do not mean Democrats, specifically establishment Democrats. I mean the left.
Adam, we're going to have to go. Thank you for the call. My quick comment. Call in some other time. We can keep the conversation going. Quick comment there. It's just the subject of an objective political truth, specifically a political truth, is notoriously contentious, and its edges are frayed. And you can, as far as I can tell, only in the modern era, at the very least, only honestly achieve that process through sort of deliberative, ongoing politics, where different demographics with different interests sort of compete to share their portion of that objective truth and to share their rights to the government's attempts to improve upon their stake in the whole thing. Anyway, that's a little bit rambling. My point is that, like, I hear you, but pushing for one objective truth is notoriously difficult in a frayed society with many different opinions about what that truth is going to be. And as far as I can tell, the best truth we can get is going to come as a result of that longer-term deliberative process, if it goes well. I don't know. That's my quick take. We do have our guest with us, though, Jareth Kopas, author of Ukraine Forever Upon. Ukraine Forever Upon. You can follow him on Twitter at Rodion Press. That's RODION PRESS. Jareth, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So we're talking about Ukraine broadly, but we're also talking about some connections between Ukraine, the United States. We're talking about Christopher Steele's subsource, Igor Danchenko. Also talking about Victoria Nuland and the State Department connection to Ukraine. Also probably going into Mykola Lebed. So I've given this more than enough territory there just in the last couple of sentences to really expand on in the next couple of segments. Maybe we should start with Christopher Steele, actually, and the recent revelations, I should say, by the New York Times that the primary subsource, Christopher Steele's primary subsource, was this guy, Igor Danchenko, a guy with the Brookings Institution, Lee Stranahan, who we had, my dad, who we had on last Friday, former host of the show, who has been talking about Strobe Talbot, who was the head of the Brookings Institution for about 15 years, and a Russia expert, the same domain of expertise as Igor Danchenko. Strobe Talbot associated with Cody Shearer, setting up the Shearer dossier, seen as the precedent to the Steele dossier in terms of the Shearer dossier, got FISA applications. It was on a lot of the same content. Those FISA applications were denied. They needed more evidence. And then the same set of people were associated right after that with the beginnings of the Steele dossier, Christopher Steele doing his investigations. Anyway, recent revelations from the New York Times on Igor Danchenko. He has connections to Ukraine. Wasn't he born there?
Yeah, he is ethnically Ukrainian. They have him listed as a Russian source, but he is Ukrainian. They're very connected. I know Ukrainian nationalists like to make it seem like Ukraine is totally separate from Russia, but they were part of the Soviet Union, part of Russia for a long, long time before 1991. So the interconnectivity between the two, a lot of people you see, if they're older than 20 to 21 years old, they were born in the Soviet Union if they were in Ukraine. So a lot of people who claim they're Ukrainian are people who were born after that time period, or people who now are more of a nationalistic sense. So yeah, he is Ukrainian.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and maybe we can keep going into some of the other weird connections.
Sure.
We're talking on Friday. I'm pretty sure you heard that interview talking about Victoria Nuland, her connections. One name we didn't bring up that I'm going to throw in here real quick is Jonathan Weiner. We really didn't talk about that last Friday. Connections to Bill Browder, interesting figure in the State Department. But maybe you can just pick it up and we can keep this conversation going. What are you thinking, Jareth?
Yeah, so it's kind of working backwards. So if you go from Igor Danchenko, who was listed as the primary subsource for Steele, like you already said, he is listed in all the reports that I've read as Russian-based, which he never was ever even Russian-based. He's in the U.S. A lot of this is kind of unverified still. This has obviously just come out over the past few days, the past week. But from what I've been able to gather, these are the factual things I've been able to find thus far. His main sources that he used were who he called his Russian friends, people who live in Russia, but they were just anecdotal mostly, and stories from these kind of people who he didn't release the names of and just said were his friends that live in Russia. So kind of hard to have them as primary sources for something such as this dossier. But moving on from that, he, like you said as well, worked for the Brookings Institute, which we can get into further. Apparently he has ties to Fiona Hill. Some people have been reporting. Like I said, much of this still remains speculative, and I've been kind of looking now into another group he worked for called SIDAR Global. The CEO or the founder of that group is kind of distancing himself quickly from Igor Danchenko, which kind of throws up a red flag for me. He says, I know he worked for me and he was a good worker, but I don't know anything about him. So that may be a place where people start looking, is into SIDAR Global. But if you go from the Brookings Institute,
real quick question before we move too far away from it. How do you spell that?
SIDAR is SIDAR, and then global.
Thank you.
So moving on from the Brookings Institute, that's can obviously lead you to Strobe Talbott, like you guys have talked about. He used deep connections with the shock therapy that happened in Russia. Obviously very connected to the Clintons, who really are at the forefront of a lot of this. Most of it, really, the current modern day aspect of all this kind of leads back to that time, because Clinton was around the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so obviously he played a big role. Talbott was the 6th president of the Brookings Institute. I mean, we could have a whole segment just on him. I know Lee's probably talked about him quite a bit. So I don't think many people have really talked about the actual Brookings Institute itself. If we want to go into that, it's been really a highly influential DC think tank for quite some years. It was at its beginnings, it seems like it was actually quite prestigious, that it was bipartisan, that it actually worked for the people, that it was giving good information that wasn't slanted one way or the other. And obviously in DC that can't last too long, and the neocons got a hold of it, and they ended up taking control of this Brookings Institute. They staffed the key positions with deep state politicians, generals, commanders of NATO, all sorts of different high-level people that you don't read about in the papers, but really pull all the strings. In 2014, there was an investigation that found them guilty of accepting gigantic payments from foreign governments. In Norway, they gave us, gave them $4 million for unspecified deliverables. They actually put deliverables in this contract in quotations, so it didn't have to be discussed what these deliverables were. But on top of that, it was all.
I want to do a quick question, sort of historically. So, Brookings Institution, founded in 1916. You were talking about this period of early prestige and sort of unbiased influence. And then you described a sort of a decline, or at least a co-optation, specifically by neocons in this more agitational militarist wing. In what era? At what period of time in the 20th century? I'm guessing. When did that happen? What decade?
From what I can kind of glean from what I've looked into, it was around the 60s that it started to happen. It was with Nixon, with everything starting to go on, where there was a rekindling of a Red Scare. It was around the 60s that it really was taken over by this neocon force and instead used for war. But after Reagan, it really became full-on neocon, because it was staffed completely with Reaganites, completely with people who followed that ideology of America can rule through war and not through actual policy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just historically, I think it's important to look at these institutions, but also since we're going into it, I just wanted to check there. But yeah, feel free to keep going.
Okay. And then if you look at really some of their donors, it ranges from Bill Gates, JP Morgan Chase, the Embassy of Qatar. I mean, you could go on and on, pretty much the who's who of big names. I mean, even Exxon, Northrop Grumman. So you've got Google, Facebook, George Soros, of course. I know if you say George Soros, you're labeled a specific conspiracy theorist or something. But if you look at the donations to the Brookings Institute, it really is this whole list of the who's who in controlling DC. Many of the donors also have their own people as either trustees or council positions, so they really control what comes out of the Brookings Institute. And if you're watching the Sunday morning political shows, if you're reading the Washington Post, even direct information from our government comes from the Brookings Institute. So if you're getting information from them, you're getting hand-packaged material from these people who pay for this. So you're getting hand-packaged stuff from Northrop Grumman, so they're pushing their war effort. You're getting stuff from Google, who are pushing their cybersecurity and cyber following you type of narrative. So you got to really look into these institutes, and if you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, if you see them at their face value, then you're not getting the full story. Along with that, like I was speaking, the multi-million-dollar deal with Norway, that was for deliverables. There was also a huge deal with Qatar, where they were paid by the the rulers in Qatar to not speak poorly of them. So they actually were silencing the staff of the Brookings Institute who were writing things that put Qatar in a negative light. And they actually had some whistleblowers come out about this. They've had people come out against them, former employees come out against them. One specifically was a gentleman called Salem Ali, who was quoted as saying, if a member of Congress is using the Brookings reports, they should be aware they are not getting the full story. So even their employees, once they're able to leave, and if they aren't in fear of really their lives, you could say, they are talking out against this institute. So
Brookings, let's go to a break.
Yeah.
We should go to a break. We'll come back in a minute. We've set the Brookings Institution up. Set Brookings up. We're going to be talking about Strobe Talbot. It's important to set that up as history because Strobe Talbot's basically the head of that for about 15 years. After he's a prominent person in the Clinton presidency, Deputy Secretary of State from 1994 to 2001. So I think it's interesting to look at it historically. It's important to know, but it's also him coming out of that position, Deputy Secretary of State, during this period after Russia's sort of dissolution and recreation as a Russian Federation, and then going into this tradition, this institution, like you're saying, for foreign political interests, and broadly a neocon, sort of more militaristic foreign policy perspective. We're going to get back into it. There are interesting connections here all over, but we're specifically talking about Ukraine. We'll get into Russiagate back in a minute, joined by Jareth Kopis, author of Ukraine Forever Upon. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Jareth?
Fault Lines.
Yeah. Can you back up? Back.
At SputnikNews.com.
Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Jareth Kopis. We're talking now about Strobe Talbot, the Brookings Institution, Christopher Steele, the connections between Christopher Steele and Strobe Talbot and this sort of wing associated with the Clintons, and the origins of a lot of the Russiagate myth and controversy, not just in the DNC, these different areas, but in parties associated with the Clintons, individual people, agents associated with the Clintons, officials in a lot of cases. And so we're sort of investigating some of that stuff. A lot of people don't know about that. We laid out the history. Jareth did a great job of laying out a lot of stuff I was only a little bit familiar with the history of the Brookings Institution. And that's very, like I was saying as we were going to the break, very useful for for giving important context, not only to a lot of what goes on in Washington, but also to the specific figure Strobe Talbot, who was again the head of Brookings from 2002, just after he left the Clinton administration to at that point, the Bush administration. He was put into place during the Clinton administration from 2002 to 2017 at Brookings. But again, he was Deputy Secretary of State during the Clinton administration, 94 to 2001, during the time period of a lot of this shock therapy stuff. And as Lee was talking about, as my dad was talking about when he was on Friday, a lot of the history of Bill Clinton, I'm guessing, and his foreign policy views goes back with to his relationship with Strobe Talbot, who was studying Russian, translating Khrushchev's memoirs from Russian into English while living at Oxford with Bill Clinton. They lived together, so there's a very deep connection. A lot of that history is there. And then not only does that lead one to be curious about his influence on the Clinton administration during the shock therapy period of Russian history during the 90s, his influence on that, but also, of course, just his influence more generally, because he was a long-term friend of Clinton's. And so this question of what influenced him, what influence he would have brought, I think that's important to understanding not just Clinton, but also his position as a political figure and his leadership, and a lot of his legacy, of course, with Hillary Clinton, a very prominent contender and also a close friend of Strobe Talbot, I hear. It's significant in all these different ways. So I'd like to get back into that. You said that you could spend a couple of segments on it. Maybe we can keep it to less than that. But yeah, where would you go from there, Jareth?
Well, really, you can talk about Strobe Talbot in the sense of him being a key component, like you already said, in a lot of what's happened in our foreign policy and what's happened in our country. As far as Russiagate and as far as what's going on in Ukraine, it's really his connection to the Brookings Institute is what connects it all. So we can continue with the connections to the Brookings Institute. That kind of leads us to Newland then. So with Newland, I mean, obviously you guys have talked about Newland. Your father's talked about Victoria Newland quite a bit, but we can give a brief. A lot of people just don't. They hear people speak about these people, but they don't really know about them. So I like to give brief histories about these people. So like with Victoria Newland, she's a career politician. She was Chief of Staff, Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy Director of the former Soviet Union for Bill Clinton. So obviously there's the link to the Clintons, back to looking with the Brookings Institute and back to Strobe Talbot. So moving on from there, she was even the foreign policy advisor to Dick Cheney. So it's not like she was specifically for the Democrats or anything. She's an opportunist, a political opportunist. She didn't have a side that she worked for. She was ambassador to NATO for the U.S. and actually holds the title of career ambassador, which is the highest rank you can get as an ambassador. And in the Ukrainian, in the Maidan coup,
also,
she was
real
really
quick before you get to the Maidan, I just don't forget to mention her spouse, her husband. Robert Kagan, neoconservative, exactly, American historian, foreign policy commentator, just a neocon. So yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but on her sort of background.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to move on to Kagan, because really Newland, I was just going to speak generally on her role with Maidan. She was the point person for the State Department. She's the woman you've heard speaking with Jeffrey Pyatt on the hacked phone call saying F the EU, and also the woman you've seen handing out bread on Maidan Square to people. But yeah, moving on to Kagan, her husband, he doesn't describe himself as a neocon. He doesn't like that term. He describes himself as a liberal interventionist. So I kind of found that funny that he sees himself as an interventionist, but he is probably, if not the most, one of the most predominant neocons on the planet. He co-founded the Project for New American Century, which is another one of these groups that is highly involved in our politics and our foreign policy. And their motto is American leadership is good both for America and the world. So they're like Brookings Institute on steroids. They go ahead and they really push that Reagan aspect of we can make the world happy with war. So they influenced really many of our policymakers, many of our foreign policy decisions were involved with this the New American Century group. So they've played a predominant role in where our country has been led. Not only was Kagan involved with that, he writes for the Washington Post. He's the editor at the New Republic. He's all over the media. He's everywhere behind the scenes, at the forefront. He pushed for war in Iraq, even went so far as to lie about it. He claimed that there were pilots being trained in Iraq that were supposed to be learning how to do suicide attacks. He also claimed that they were holding camps on how to hijack Boeing 707s, which obviously was not true. That was never verified. It was just to push this war with Iraq for obvious reasons, the oil and pushing foreign policy. And that's what that group was about. He was a self-proclaimed Republican for his entire career until 2016 when he switched because of what he said was Trump's fascistic policies. So he called Trump a fascist, and now he's a raging Democrat, apparently, but that's still yet to be seen. He is deeply entwined with the State Department, held many different positions in the State Department, and then he's also leading back to the Brookings Institute, a fellow at the Brookings Institute as well. So there's not only him, his wife, Victoria Newland, who holds high-level positions, Strobe Talbot himself, all lead back to the Brookings Institute, as well as Igor Danchenko working for the Brookings Institute. So really, this whole institute is able to connect a lot of these people. And we can go even further with that. I know we talk about the Chalupas a lot, but if you continue with that, the Chalupas are also entwined with this whole group as well. I didn't know if you had somewhere else you wanted to go off of that, but if you want, I can continue with giving a description with the chalupas.
For it. Yeah, let's go into that. And then, I mean, obviously that connects to the Maidan too. We can get back into Victoria Nuland's role there, the whole at the EU thing. But yeah, go for it with the chalupas.
Okay, again, with the chalupas, I mean, a lot of people hear that name. A lot of people think they know who these people are. A lot of people don't even know that it's two separate people. They're Chalupa sisters. So a brief overview of the chalupas. They're
just real quick, I think for most people it just makes them hungry.
Yeah.
Don't mean to be cynical there, but yeah.
So their parents are Tanya Kais and Leo Chalupa, who were supposedly they were both born in refugee camps that were 60 miles away from each other in Germany in 1945. So her parents were from the Ukraine, from Eastern Ukraine, and we'll get into their backstory a little bit after I give a brief description of Andrea and Alexander, or Ali Chalupa. So Andrea is the younger sister. She's an author. She has a podcast. She's not as politically intertwined with these types of organizations as her older sister, but she is quite the pusher of Ukrainian propaganda. She wrote a book called Orwell and the Refugees with her grandfather, Alexei, who will also speak on him further, but talks about the plight of the Ukrainian people in the Soviet Union, along with the Holodomor, which we spoke about. She's just produced a movie that I'm actually writing a book to counter called Mr. Jones, about Gareth Jones, who was a Welsh reporter who the Ukrainians say was the first person to reveal the Holodomor, which he did nothing of the sort. He reported that there was famine in the Soviet Union, which during the time of that world depression, obviously we discussed this a little bit, there was famine all over the Soviet Union. There was famine in the United States. There was people starving everywhere. So, but they're turning this gentleman, this reporter, into their proof. And that there is no proof when it comes to this guy's reporting. It's just his connections to Nazi sympathizers, himself being a Nazi sympathizer. He worked for Ivy Lee, who is one of the fathers. We can talk about that another time. Andrea.
Wait, actually, Jareth, I'm going to do something slightly dramatic here. We've just gone over the dramatis personae of various key players in Russiagate, to take it back home to the States, but also broadly in Ukraine, in Russia, in international affairs. I actually want to hand it over, though, to Jamarl for a second. He hasn't been involved in the convo at all. We were talking back and forth. He had a question, I think, about your book. Jamarl, are you there?
Yeah, I do have a question. Your book, For Ukraine, where did the name come from? I mean, is this coming from basically Ukraine's position where it's this intermediary between the West and the East, and how Ukraine has basically been used as this kind of attack point, or this pivot point between those two items? What's the reason for naming the book For Ukraine?
Yeah, precisely that. It's for centuries, Ukraine, this land, this borderland, and the peoples who have inhabited it have been the intermediary, as you said, the people caught in the middle between great powers. I have nothing but sympathy for the people in this country and for the people who have inhabited this land. So I set out to show people that not only were they being used as pawns, but they were being tricked into doing it. They weren't being used as foot soldiers in an actual army, but they were being tricked to join things that ran counter to what could actually advance them as a country and as a people. They were being completely fooled, completely tricked, and that's been going on in cycles for thousands of years from both sides. And that's not just from the West, that's from Russia and from other countries as well. So really, Ukraine has been seeking its independence for many, many years, and frankly, it will never have its independence if it continues to seek its independence through being a subordinate of other countries, is what I was hoping to achieve with that title.
When you say that they're going down the wrong political path, what do you mean? Give me an example of an improper path, or something that would have been in their best interest versus them choosing something that's not.
So if you look at World War II, they decided to throw their lot behind the fascists, behind fascism, behind Nazism, and they decided this, and this, by meaning this people, I mean this small group, the people who were nationalists at the time, because not all Ukrainians are along with that group, so I can't lump them all together. But during that time, Ukraine was taken by this group and led in a poor direction, which sullied the name of Ukraine, made them aligned with this fascistic leadership along with the Nazis. That was a poor route that they took. They thought they could seek their independence through fascism. And again, today, they're doing the same thing. If you look at the people that are now fighting against the ceasefire that is actually holding somewhat in Donbass now, the people who are fighting against the ceasefire that will bring peace are that same fascistic ideal.
Yeah, we've talked about that a bit before. We're going to have to go to a break. We'd love to have you back on soon to go deeper into exactly that. We're talking with Jareth Kopis, author of Ukraine Forever Upon. Quick note, if you want to read his work, follow him, you can on Twitter at Rodion Press, RODION Press. Jareth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
All right, have a good day, folks. We'll be back tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern. Again, you've listened to the most disruptive show in American politics, in the multiverse. We are Fault Lines, Thomas.
Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining me, as always. Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. I'm going to be back on in like a very few minutes. I'm going to be back on in a very few minutes. Awesome show, as always. This has been, several weeks at this point, and we've been able to pull this off pretty well. So, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I am going to say subscribe. I'll talk to you guys in a few. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you momentarily.